is of Adam.
All right, we're rolling.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the June 8th study session. Okay. Welcome to the June 8th study session of the Boulder City Council. I think we will commence with Ryan, who will discuss our interpretive services for this evening.
Thank you. One moment while I pull this up. Okay, we do have interpretation of our COVID briefing this evening. And a reminder to everyone participating, please click mute when you are not speaking. And then this is also very important, especially for presenters, to please make sure that you select a language. So even right now, if you are hearing language, use the icon in the lower menu to select English or to select Spanish. And a reminder to all speakers to make sure to speak slowly, clearly pronouncing each word and taking a breath between sentences. We'll do our best to not speak over one another. And if you select a English or Spanish channel to continue speaking in that one language, and to avoid using idioms where we can. So again, thank you for selecting the language that works for you and for remembering to speak slowly, clearly pronouncing each word and taking a breath between sentences.
Thank you, Ryan. We will commence with a couple of brief announcements. The first one relates to COVID-19 vaccinations. We are continuing our efforts to get everyone vaccinated. And for more local information on getting your vaccine or to sign up for notifications, please go to the lengthy link below of www.bouldercounty.org/families/disease/COVID-19/vaccines. We encourage everyone to who can and who has not been vaccinated to do so. It is for your health and it is for the health of the community. Our second announcement tonight is with respect to 2021 boards and commissions. If we can advance to that slide. We're continuing to accept nominations for applications to the following boards: the Boulder Junction Access District, Parking, Boulder Junction Access District, Travel Demand Management, and the Beverage Licensing Authority. If you are interested in serving on any of these boards, and all boards are important, please view our boards and commissions website at bouldercolorado.gov/boards-commissions. And with that, I think we can commence with the study session itself. I will turn it over to Nuria to introduce the first presenters.
Thanks so much, Mark, and good evening, everybody. We have our first presentation as a COVID update, and we welcome Lexi Nolan and her staff and as our partners in Boulder County.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting Boulder County Public Health to talk to you a little bit tonight. We continue to have good news to share with folks. Do you guys have my presentation or shall I throw it up myself? I'm happy to do that. Give me just a sec. Great. Okay, can you see it? Terrific. Thank you. So this is a presentation, just some quick updates on our vaccination in cases. We continue to look like we're in good shape. Across the Denver metro area, about 67% of the eligible population has now been vaccinated. This is important because we know that counties don't have entrance gates. So what's happening around us continues to be important, and it looks like we are continuing to increase our vaccinations in neighboring counties. Across Boulder County, you can see that we have reached over 75% vaccination in a number of geographic areas, and those areas that have lower numbers also tend to be less dense population areas. In terms of specific individuals, in Boulder County, we have over 73.5% of our eligible population has now received at least one vaccination. Our vaccine rates are declining a little bit, but we are continuing to see some consistent vaccinations, almost 1,000 a day in Boulder County. And if we look at a breakout by age, and I'm going to slow down a little for our interpreters. If we look at the breakout by age, we see some really substantially excellent numbers for those over 30 years old, at almost 80% in every age category, which is fantastic. Our 12 to 19-year-olds are now over 50% with at least one vaccine, and 20 to 29s at 56.7. So we are, if we could achieve these kinds of numbers in the 30 and above age group going into the fall, we would be in really remarkable shape as a county. In terms of distributions, this is a quick chart that shows how many folks we have left in various age and race ethnicity categories to support for access to vaccines. The asterisk indicates that it's such a small number that it's not statistically significant. And if we look at our cases, if we switch over from vaccines to our cases, we see that our 7-day rolling average continues to decline. It's now at about 7.6 cases a day per 100,000, which is excellent. You can also see that our cases in all age groups have really substantially reduced, even from just a few weeks ago. That is an effect of the vaccinations. We are continuing to see some disparities, but you can also see that those numbers have declined substantially, which is excellent news. In terms of distribution of cases among municipalities, we are seeing more cases in Longmont than Boulder proportionally, as well as in absolute numbers. So we are continuing to have vaccination clinics, both in Longmont and Boulder and across the county in various spaces. In terms of hospitalizations, I think everybody remembers that this blue line here indicates the level at which we would snap back into a more restrictive approach to addressing the pandemic, and we are not anywhere near that blue level. Boulder County is the dark red line, and the Denver Metro average is the pink line above it. Our deaths remain low. We are occasionally seeing a death that is considered a probable COVID death, but those numbers are becoming more scarce. That frequency of deaths is becoming more scarce. And finally, our 7-day positivity is now at around 1%, which is excellent. We are seeing the reproduction number is continuing to go down. It's well below 1. So we expect cases to continue to decline on this pathway. And that's our update for tonight.
Thank you, Lexi. Let me turn it back to council. Any comments or questions? That's a good comment, Mary. Bob, I think you're up.
Thank you, Lexi. Good report. Just a quick question on the 20 to 29 group. Of course, many of those tend to be CU students. When we're calculating the percentage of vaccination for CU students, is the denominator the number of CU students who were resident before they may have gone back home to a place that's not Boulder, and therefore those numbers might be artificially low? In other words, the numerator is people who are actually vaccinated. The denominator may be people who are actually not physically in Boulder right now. I know they have to be vaccinated to return to CU in the fall, but is there an artificial suppression of that number because of maybe transients during the summertime?
Thanks for that question. That's an excellent question. And the answer is yes, we think that there probably is, that the numbers in that age group reflect artificially low, that number could be quite a bit higher. The vaccination reporting often is in relation to a student's permanent address, how it's listed in the state registration. So it may not necessarily be reflecting on Boulder County statistics. So we do try to put a little bit of a caution on that 20 to 29 age group. And in fact, it would even relate to 18 and 19-year-olds also. Thanks for the question. CU does have a mandatory vaccination requirement going into the fall. So we are confident that even if, the data system is an imperfect system, which we know sometimes it is, that we will be able to catch a lot of those students as they come back into Boulder in August.
Great. Thanks, Lexi.
Sam, you're up.
Great. Thanks, Lexi, for being here, as always. The one thing that stood out for me from your presentation was, I think, slide 7, which had the different ethnicities and vaccination rates. And it looked to me like younger Hispanic population was 25 or 30 points below the average for the county. Is there a particular focused effort to work on that population, which seems to be falling pretty far behind?
Another great question, and the answer is yes. What we are finding is just that we need to continue to provide extra supports to some folks to get access to the vaccine. It has less to do with hesitancy than it does with just making it as easy as we can and removing barriers. We are working with employers to look at the possibility of bringing vaccination clinics on site for large employers, as well as for particular employee groups that just might have extra barriers. We're looking into also how we can support, because we have such a wide age range that's now eligible, how we can support family approaches to vaccination so that a whole family can get vaccinated at once. And our community ambassadors that we've been working with over the past couple months, which are community-based organizations like El Paso, El Centro Amistad, Peak to Peak, and some other groups out Boulder, continue to work with us to put feet on the ground and calls into families and households to make sure that they have all the supports that they need to get access to the vaccines.
Great. And just one more question. Do you have any thoughts about why it's seems to be a big difference by age? Because it seems like the older Hispanic population is not as far off as the younger Hispanic population.
We think it largely has to do with just the barrier of getting to a vaccine given working hours. And so we have made some adjustments in recent weeks to make sure that our clinics, that people have access after working hours and on weekends. And we're going to continue to support that space to make sure that if working hours are a barrier to getting a vaccine, that we have some solutions for that.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Are there any other comments or questions from council? Seeing none. Lexi, thank you so much. It's always nice to hear good news.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ryan, am I correct that this is the point at which the interpretive services terminate?
That is correct.
Okay. So for those who are using the interpretation services, that will no longer be applicable going forward. And now I will return it to Nuria to introduce the next presenters.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Sorry to interrupt, Nuria, but before we do that, I'm getting an email from a constituent saying that Channel 8 is being spotty. So I don't know if there's anything we can do about that or if that's one particular person's problem, but just want to pass that along so folks can look into it.
Thanks so much. We'll certainly look into it and make sure that we respond. Our next presentation is a quick little ARPA update. I'll share with you that we have created for this work a cross-departmental team. It includes a variety of directors from different departments, including CMO representation, but we were really happy that Yvette was able to lend us Mark Wolf, who is going to be sharing the presentation and has been acting as project manager for this particular initiative.
Great, thank you, Nuria. Happy to be with you tonight, Council. Again, my name is Mark Wolf, Senior Manager of Economic Vitality and Business Services, and in the role of coordinating the city's use of ARPA dollars. We appreciate the time to squeeze in a few minutes tonight. We know this is an important subject to discuss ARPA, the local recovery funds that Boulder will receive through ARPA, and opportunities to support our community in the recovery from COVID. To begin, I think it is important to provide some context related to the entire ARPA package and the resources that are available to the community through both the local relief portion of the bill and other provisions. Hopefully this slide format will look familiar. We used this to help describe CARES funding and hope you will find it helpful for ARPA as well. The $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, was signed into law on March 11th of this year and provided some immediate relief to families and individuals through expanded stimulus payments, enhanced unemployment benefits, rental assistance, and SNAP and WIC expansion. Additionally, ARPA delivered expanded access to COVID testing and vaccines, childcare, mental health services, and direct assistance for healthcare and emergency workers. Much of this assistance is administered through the state or the county, and I'll return to that point in a moment. ARPA also provided direct community and economic funding, including support for the arts, regional transportation, and resources to address the digital divide. To promote economic recovery, ARPA expanded the Payroll Protection Program, or PPP, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, or EIDL, and established new programs in the Restaurant Revitalization Fund and the Shuttered Venue Grant Program. Separate from everything mentioned so far, ARPA also provided $362 billion in state and local fiscal recovery funds. Tonight, I will talk about Boulder's allocation. However, it's important to remember, and something that staff will continue to focus on, that communicating the existing resources and coordinating on upcoming resources with the state and county are critical to ensuring the maximum positive impact on our community members and businesses. Next slide, please. Now, apologies for all the words here, but I promise I'll walk through it. Shifting a little bit to the local relief portion of this, state, county, and local governments are all receiving direct recovery funds based on the size of population. The City of Boulder's allocation is $20.15 million, and we are scheduled to receive the first tranche of funds, or approximately $10 million, in the next days or weeks. The second tranche of funds, the remaining $10 million, will be received in 1 year, June of 2022. There are many allowable uses for the funds, and I won't go into detail on all of them. I'm certainly happy to elaborate if there are questions. I want to take council back to the local funding provided through CARES for a moment and just contrast some key differences. First, the ARPA funds are much more flexible and thus allows us to better align funding with city and community goals. Second, we have much more time to spend the money, in this case, all the way through the end of 2024. If you remember, the initial deadline to spend CARES dollars was the end of 2020. And last, there is a specific intent in ARPA language to reach the communities disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. As of last week, we are still operating under interim guidance from the Department of Treasury. for how to use the money. However, we think we're in a pretty good shape and have enough direction to begin to align our funding priorities to our city goals and to ensure our process is prepared to apply the racial equity instrument to all funding recommendations. Similar to how we approached investment using CARES dollars, staff is starting with an outline of guiding principles, including key funding areas of city organizational and financial recovery, community recovery, economic recovery, and transformative infrastructure. With the longer timeline and greater flexibility, there is an opportunity to be strategic in how we leverage our funding to stretch impact as far as possible in collaboration with state and regional partners. However, this will be balanced with Boulder specific needs and with the knowledge that there is still immediate need in our community for sustained support. Our immediate focus will be twofold. One, to identify fast-tracked efforts that align with community goals, including areas where ARPA funds can complement phased restoration of city services based on revenue projections. And two, to set the table for collaborative efforts that meet the long-term vision of the community. This will happen while we continue to monitor and communicate other sources of support and funding that our community will have access to either through ARPA or outside of ARPA. Next slide, please. All right, and the last slide to give you a brief overview of proposed timing. As mentioned, we expect to have the first tranche of funds shortly. Our next steps include providing the short-term funding proposals and additional guidance and detail on priority funding areas to support the long-term recovery later in July. That information will be prepared in preparation for and in concert with a special ATB in August, where we will discuss revised revenue projections, potential phase service return, and the initial use of ARPA dollars. As funding recommendations are approved and expenditures are made, Council and the community will be receiving updates through the use of a similar dashboard as CARES funds were reported and through other reporting as required by the federal government. Council will consider the 2022 budget in September and October. So there will be another opportunity to visit about ARPA funds then. And last, in preparation for the second tranche in 2022, we plan to continue the conversation about long-term funding, transparency, and the planning efforts to make transformational impact later this year. To close, with Council support, staff will continue to work to identify potential gaps in resources and funding, coordinate with the county and other regional partners, and provide greater specificity to the goals and priorities within our key funding areas. As stated, we will provide an update later in July and come back with some initial early areas of potential funding as a part of the larger special ATB in August. I threw a ton of information at you in just a few minutes, so we're happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mark. Looking for hands. Mary, you're first, then Junie, then Aaron.
I believe Junie's hand went up first.
Then Junie, you're up.
Thanks. Thank you for this presentation. And I understand this is an evolving presentation on how the money will be used. We received an email from the planning board, and again, I noticed this is a broad overview, kind of umbrella, not very focused on specific items, but I wanted to know if you're working maybe with, planning board, or had you had the opportunity to see some of the, I guess, not necessarily requests, but opportunities for supporting community. For instance, some of the, the ask they put forward was maybe helping residents with critical home repair needs, whether it's mortgages, taxes, and utilities assistance. So I wonder if this is something that, you already thinking through, or will you be working with the planning board to come up with these solutions?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'll start and happy to yield the answer to this. I think, yes, absolutely. We are researching those potential uses of funds. We are working very closely with the Boulder County Funders Collaborative through our Housing and Human Services Department. They are a part of our staff team. I think we want to be very intentional about identifying the gaps that do exist and investing in those areas. So you're right, it is a process. We know there's still need out there, but we want to make sure that need gets to the right places.
Thank you.
Mary?
So,
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you, Junie, did you have more? Okay. Mary, you're up.
Thanks, Junie, for asking that question. That was on my list. My other question has to do with infrastructure and what projects, are there any examples that you are currently considering in terms of the transportation infrastructure and the broadband infrastructure? Are there any specifics yet, or is it still in generalities?
Thank you for the question. I think infrastructure is a really important piece of this. There is nothing specific at the moment. The use of local relief dollars does allow water, wastewater, and broadband as potential uses for infrastructure. I think the other thing that we would like to prepare for is a potential larger infrastructure jobs package from the federal government, state and county resources through ARPA as well. So again, it'll be a matter of planning well and determining which projects are in prime position to receive funding, whether through our local relief recovery funds or through other programs.
Thank you for that.
Aaron?
Yeah, thanks. Ginny also asked one of my questions about the planning board, so thanks for that, Ginny. And so it sounds like, Mark, that you all are thinking carefully too about, there's lots of other ARPA funding coming through, right? And we may be eligible for many different money from many different buckets, right? So I assume that's part of your analysis, right?
Yeah. Right.
It is. I think there's a couple examples of that. One is there's grants available to localities for continued vaccinations. There's other relief to regional transportation districts. So certainly our collaboration with RTD. Those are just a couple small examples, but to your point, ARPA is a very big package, almost $2 trillion. And part of our work as a staff team will be to make sure we're not missing out on those opportunities.
Fantastic. And then in terms of council's ability to weigh in on what the priorities should be, is our first real crack at that in that August special ATB, or will there be, it sounded like the earlier updates might be just one way telling us how things are going. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think we'd like to outline a few potential early uses of funds. Again, that gap analysis of what the immediate need is. In terms of fleshing out the funding areas in our guiding principles, August, I think, would be the first chance to really get into a deeper discussion.
Great, that makes sense. Now, just to encourage you all to maybe leave some latitude for council input, as we funnel what we hear from the community in. So, maybe rather than presenting as a 100% baked, here's how we'd like to spend every single dollar, maybe there'll be, we could have some latitude for a discussion on how we spend those dollars.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And one thing I'd point out is that because we're bringing it as a part of a special ATB and before the 2022 budget process, I think there will be a lot of good opportunity to hear from council as to what the community is saying and make sure we're identifying the right source of funds for that, whether it be that revised revenue projections as a part of the 2021 budget or looking forward into 2022, whether that's ARPA or another source of funding.
Very good. Thanks so much. That's all I had.
Bob, you're next.
Yeah, just building on that discussion, Mark, that you were having with Aaron about timing. I'm sure that you guys are already thinking about this, but of course we're considering this summer, and I think we're going to make some decisions in August about our community culture safety tax and what might get funded there. So it would be obviously a shame if we put some things in the community culture safety tax that otherwise could be funded by ARPA. So I'm sure you guys are cross-departmentally coordinated on that and making sure that what can get paid by ARPA doesn't end up in the tax, and those things that end up in the tax are those things that ARPA couldn't otherwise support.
Yes, thank you for that point. And we're absolutely monitoring the interplay between not just our budget process, but CCS across all of our departments, and finance is a big part of that conversation.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Any other comments or questions? If not, I'll weigh in with one comment of my own, which is in support of Aaron's comment that there should be some robust community discussion about these things. There should be some opportunity for input from the council, and I would urge you not to, as Aaron said, bake in the final decisions too firmly. People do have a very strong interest in this.
Absolutely appreciate that, and like I said, we have a lot longer to spend the money, and so we anticipate much more process for a good chunk of the money.
Okay. And with that, seeing no further comments or questions, thank you, Mark. This is a second presentation of good news. I'm beginning to really enjoy this study session. If hopefully we can keep that going, but I will turn this back to Nuria for the next presentation.
Thanks so much, Mark. Before we turn it over to our guest presenter today, as we turn to all things climate at the moment, our next presentation is really going to be about an Xcel Energy update on the 2021 Electric Resource Plan. I wanted to frame it up a little bit, as we have all received a lot of communications, a lot of interest in the topic recently, and just say that we know as a community that our partners and ourselves throughout the state have aggressive targets to address the emissions associated from our electric use. We ourselves have a goal of 100% renewable energy by 2030. And as you'll hear later this evening, aggressive goals around carbon emissions as well. Xcel Energy, who's the electricity provider for Boulder and more than half our state, their success really in reducing their emissions is critical to us as we think to achieve our goals. We are therefore pleased to be joined by Alice Jackson, the president of Xcel Energy Colorado, to present details on the electric resource plan that they recently filed with the Public Utilities Commission, or PUC. Xcel's clean energy plan will underpin the necessary advancement of the broad range of wind, solar, storage, and demand response resources in our state. Xcel's submission is extremely long and complex, and it will take some time to unpack the specifics of that plan. And as those details emerge, we really expect that there will be elements of the plan that really resonate with our community, and others where we may have concern or see greater opportunity to do more. So to be clear to our community members, and we thank you for your input and your messages, tonight is not a public hearing, nor is it an endorsement of ourselves of Xcel's filing. Tonight's presentation by Xcel is intended to give our community and staff a better understanding of their strategies and what this might mean for Boulder as we pursue our renewable electricity goal. I want to assure our community members that this is just the beginning of that community conversation. We're committed to continuing the conversation publicly and providing opportunities for the community to engage in this important topic and share their perspectives. And the city is a formal intervener in the electric resource plan, and it is our intention to reflect the input of our community throughout every turn of this process. So with that, I'd very much like to introduce Alice Jackson.
Good evening. Thank you, Nuria. I really appreciate the introduction. It's a great summary to start with, because you're exactly right. We're at the starting gate on the conversation of what this is going to look like. And so I'm looking forward to sharing with you all tonight what was in that initial filing, as well as how the process is going to unfold over the next roughly 2 years as we walk through the process that an electric resource plan goes through. I also very much look forward to hearing your questions this evening and diving in. I know there's going to be plenty of them, and these won't be the only ones that we run into as far as the conversation and what people are interested in or curious about as we go through the process. So happy to continue engaging on this topic, whether it's here with you all directly, with the community, or with the process that we'll be going through at the Public Utilities Commission. But before I do that, I'd be remiss to say thank you. It was this time last year that I think we really were just kicking off the process of having a deep conversation about, can we figure out how to go back into a franchise agreement and work together towards really deep carbon reductions on the system, really focusing on the environmental impacts of the energy sector and how that impacts you all, and figuring out how we can come back together and really partner to show different communities what the possibilities are. And so we stand here today having an exciting conversation and fulfilling some of those commitments that we made in order to share details, to get the filing out there, and also to look at what this is going to be like, not only for the city of Boulder, but for the state of Colorado. I'm excited to dive into some of the details with you all today. Like I said, feel free to write down questions. I know we're going to have a Q&A when I finish. I'm going to try and move through it fairly quickly so that we can get to some of those questions, because I know there are a number of them. And then directly following my presentation, there's going to be a specific update on the partnership. And I think Carolyn's going to lead that here after I'm complete. So let's go ahead and dive in. Just some reminder basics for those of you who are joining us new from the community on the next slide. Xcel Energy does operate in the state of Colorado. We have an electric system. We also offer natural gas services. We also have, not on this slide, but a small steam business that is the longest continuously operating steam business in downtown Denver. And so that is another piece of the puzzle as we serve customers here. But we don't only serve Colorado. We also have 7 other states that we have the pleasure of serving as Xcel Energy. And those range from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan through Wisconsin and Minnesota over to North and South Dakota, New Mexico, and Texas. So you can see a wide swath down through the center US where we're offering our services, both electric and gas, in many of those different locations. The climate opportunities that we have and our carbon commitments that we have made are across all 8 of our states. I, of course, am going to focus on Colorado, but as we all know, it's not just Colorado that needs to make advancements. It is much broader than us. It's not only the US, it's around the world. So the broader reach that we have, the better the example that we can set across all of this drives better climate outcomes for all of our customers, all Coloradans, but more importantly, everyone around the world. So figuring out how do we bring these puzzles together is the real challenge of the day that we continue to look at. Next slide, please. When we look at specifically Colorado, though, and we power the economy here, there it goes. We do have roughly $1.3 billion that we spend in our local economies on an annual basis. And that is really going to a variety of opportunities for our communities, whether that's building wind and solar farms, or that's operating the transmission and distribution, managing the rest of the generation fleet that we have, or the pipelines that we have to operate in order to provide heat and comfort to our customers through the natural gas system. There's a variety of investment that we are making in the state. We also employ roughly 4,300 employees in the state of Colorado. And I'm really happy to say, and this is a conversation that we had last year with some of the community meetings, is that we spend roughly $85 million with diverse suppliers here in the state of Colorado. And what that means is that these are minority, small, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, LGBTQ, a variety of places where we truly cultivate, and we're increasing this number every single year. It's a specific focus of ours to make sure that we're putting money back into the communities that we have the pleasure to serve, which then in turn engenders the economic development that we all need and look forward to. Last but certainly not least, we are the largest property taxpayer in the state of Colorado because of the variety of assets that we have and how we have to operate those in order to serve the electric system. So let's dive into some of the carbon numbers. Next slide, please. These numbers aren't unfamiliar to you. In fact, we released our sustainability report just recently, I think it was earlier this week, to talk about the achievements that we've reached thus far. Across the corporation, so then across those 8 states I was mentioning previously, we have achieved a 51% carbon reduction from our 2005 levels in 2020. Those were the actual results and outcomes. And so that was a really big milestone for us and a big number that we've been able to cross, and we're going to continue to press forward. As you know, we were also the first utility in the country to announce an 80% carbon reduction goal by 2030 across all 8 of those states, and aiming for a zero carbon system by 2050. Now, good news is also in the state of Colorado, with the already approved energy transition and generation assets that we're looking at, we expect to hit roughly a 60% carbon reduction by 2026. And so that's a really, good trajectory that we're going on here. It's not just like we're going to go through 2029 and then hit that cliff to get to the 80%. It is a continual operation of transitioning the system and really eliminating some of that carbon from our generation assets. That also takes the renewable resources to higher and higher levels in that same time frame in 2025, 2026 timeframe. We expect to be delivering 55% of the kilowatt hours to our customers from renewable resources. But as part of 2019's legislative session, a couple of bills came forward that laid out how do we go before the Public Utilities Commission to truly look at how do we achieve an 80% carbon reduction cost effectively for our customers, or I should say at least an 80% carbon reduction, and bring that forward to the commission for evaluation, not only by the commission itself, but also by our communities, our customers, and other interested stakeholders. We started that process the tail end of March, just as we had committed to in our energy partnership agreement to make that filing before March 31 or on or before. We did end up making it on March 31st in order to be able to move that process forward. So let's talk a little bit about the components of what this comes to. Next slide, please. Really, there are three main components that we focus on when we talk about the energy transition and what we need to accomplish as a state, and particularly for Xcel Energy customers prior to 2030. Now, I'm going to talk about the first one because usually it's been an interesting exercise for us to move through to look at what's the chicken and what's the egg, transmission or generation. By that, I mean is historically, what you would do is you would site where you needed a new generation asset, and then you would build the transmission to that location. And typically, those generation assets historically, have been the fossil-based generation. Take about 4 to 5 years to construct and go through the process. So transmission had plenty of time in order to build out to where those locations were going to be located and being decided to be built. Now, though, however, with the wind and the solar resources only taking roughly 18 months to construct once they have been approved and they're ready to move forward, we now have a chicken and egg problem again because the transmission is now taking a tad bit longer. For example, on the eastern plains of Colorado, we have roughly 4,000 megawatts of wind resources installed, but we don't have a significant backbone to deliver that back to the city centers and to where the customers are living and using that power. We have largely radial lines that are bringing that transmission or that energy back to the city centers. And so we have to look at how do you build out a robust network to deliver that energy back? But we have to do that now before the assets are actually sited. We know where the wind is. We have all the wind speeds and the information associated with that. We also know where the best solar intensity in the state is. We also know where the past couple of ERPs, our developers have bid into the process, those resources. So with that information, we constructed what's called the Colorado Power Pathway, which is a transmission solution that routes through eastern Colorado across the plains where the wind blows strongly, where the sun and the solar radiance is at its highest levels, aside from San Luis Valley, because I know people ask about that one. But in order to be able to deliver that back to the city centers, we then went before the commission and said, here is a backbone of transmission we need to start working on prior to knowing precisely where those wind resources and those solar resources are going to be built in order to meet the needs, not only of Xcel Energy system, but the rest of the states or some of the other utilities as well in the state. So that was presented earlier in March. But the other two components that are associated with this plan are two very driving factors. First, the coal action plan in combination with the just transition elements. The reason these two go together is, first off, we have to decide what we're doing with the remaining coal facilities in the state. And I'll get into deeper details on that. But just as important of looking at that is looking at the communities that are going to be impacted by this transition. How can we help them? What do they want? Do they want to be centers that are focused on energy going forward, or do they want something else? How do we help the employees? How do we look at the different factors, the tax base? And what can we do in order to solve those problems concurrent with the closures and the transitions that we're talking about? So those come together. The third component, new clean energy. It goes without saying that in order to make the transition, we have to move to zero carbon resources, which means we've got to figure out how and where are we adding this wind and solar. So those are all three main components that we look at, but I'm going to go through a little bit of each of those with you today. Next slide, please. So as we move forward and we look at the next transition, this is just a map of the Colorado Power Pathway. This is generally where it's going to be going on the eastern plains. It's roughly 560 miles of new 345 kV double circuit that will allow and enable roughly 6,000 megawatts of renewable resources to be delivered back to city centers. So this is where they can interconnect, and it reduces the amount of distance that they would have to go. It goes through a number of renewable energy zones that were determined in the state back in the early 2000s to mid 2000s. And accesses a variety of areas. The geography also of this really matters because, as you know, we have the monsoons that roll off the mountains during the summer times. They hit different areas of the Eastern Plains, so you don't want everything grouped in one location from a geographic perspective in order to deliver that energy back to the customers that need it. So you need a very broad area where you can have that interconnection and you can put multiple resources in different places. This enables that. So we're excited to go through the process. This is before the commission right now. We expect to go to hearing the later portion of this year, probably a decision from the commission early next year. And then it will be moving on to the construction phase in order to get it ready for the new energy resources to be added in. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the coal action plan. This is what we've presented to the commission as the initial volley of here's to consider the options that we have. We already have plant announcements that we've made in regards to retirements. We have a small portion of joint ownership in Craig 1 and 2, and those are announced to be retired in 25 and 28. Hayden 1 and 2, we have a larger share of ownership in, but we also have 2 other co-owners in that facility. We are the operator, and that is, we've announced retirements of Hayden 2 in 27 and Hayden 1 in 28. And Hayden has been the community that we've been working with a whole lot to talk about what it is that they would like long-term in the transition. And I can get into some of those details here in just a minute. But that's not all of the plants that we have in Colorado that are powered by coal. We have 2 others. Pawnee, we are recommending to the commission that we convert it to natural gas by 2028. The pipeline for the natural gas resource is really close by. It significantly reduces the emissions from that particular facility. It also has an end of life of roughly 2041. So it gives us a little bit more time to really work on transitioning technology to get to zero carbon fuels that maybe we can burn in combustion turbines. It helps balance out some of the costs for our customers. And so looking at this conversion, it's one of the options that we've presented to the commission as the preferred plan to move forward, along with the other scenarios that we've put out there. Last but certainly not least, and I know this one raises angst and ire, it depends on which side you're on, which community you reside in, but this one is we've tried to find the most balanced solution that we can for the overall plan and continuing to achieve the target and in fact exceed the target. Comanche 3, we are recommending to the commission that we move the official anticipated retirement date from 2070 to 2040, as well as to operate it post 2029, so starting in 2030, at roughly a third of its capacity factor, meaning that it would only come on in those times when we don't have other resources to fill the gap. Now, we've gotten a lot of questions about this one, and we've gotten a lot of concerns from various people saying, why don't you just close it now? The problem is that if we were to put this plan into place and we were to close this resource in 2030, we would have to build, it's estimated in the modeling tools, roughly 500 megawatts to 800 megawatts more of natural gas fired resources. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out the transition for the technology to bring things out of the system. And we need to buy just a little bit more time because those technologies are not ready for implementation between now and 2030. We're hopeful that they're going to come forward. In fact, we are very hopeful that we're going to get combustion turbines on the system that burn hydrogen, ammonia, or some kind of hydrogen ammonia blend as we go through the process. And in fact, we've put that directly in the filing saying we're looking for these things. The beauty of an electric resource plan, though, is we go in with a lot of modeling information and the best available information we have at that point in time. But they are generic resources. And what that means is that we bring to the table known commodities and information based off of pricing that's available from NREL for each of these resources. That doesn't guarantee, however, what resources are going to come out of the competitive solicitation. And we go far and wide, and we are known here in Colorado for having robust competitive solicitations for our electric resource plans. In fact, there was an article just published last month again about the resource plan acquisition that we did in 2017 and 18, where it said we still show that we got the lowest pricing implementation as well for our wind and our solar resources in the state of Colorado that are currently being built and brought online. Nobody else in the country has beat that solicitation and the pricing that we received for those resources. We're hoping to see that again. We have often beat the NREL pricing, but we're also putting the notes out there to various industries, saying, bring us your creative solutions, bring us options to look at so that we can try and drive even further beyond what this initial plan is presenting. So let's move to the punchline though. If you'll go to the next slide, please. And the punchline for the next slide is that we're looking at a substantial amount of renewable resources being added to the system. When you look at the numbers here, of course, you have to start with the baseline. The baseline on our system is our customers utilize roughly a peak of 7,000 megawatts annually. Or I'm sorry, the peak hour that we have, so 7,000 megawatts. When you look at what you have to build on the system in order to satisfy that 7,000 megawatts, there are a number of different resources you have to have in your arsenal in order to be able to manage the reliability of the system. That includes managing reliability through our blizzards, through our bomb cyclones, through our winter storms like Uri that we had in February, as well as during those really hot summer weeks whenever it's pretty intense and there's no wind during those time frames. So we really have to balance across the gamut. But with the plan that we've put forward, you saw the retirements that we are suggesting. In addition, though, as a solution, we're looking forward to bringing in and adding wind of roughly 2,300 megawatts, utility scale solar of 1,600 megawatts, battery storage of around 400 megawatts, dispatchable resources included, which is all of our community solar gardens, that's the rooftop solar, the other options that customers install themselves. That's an incremental of 1,300 megawatts between now and 2030 as well. So a variety of pieces of the puzzle coming together here. Now, that also doesn't mean, though, that we have no need for other types of flexible resources. There's another bucket that we talk about called flexible resources of roughly 1,400 megawatts. We are hopeful that the bidding process that comes in through that will bring us, like I was mentioning, hydrogen-fired CPs, more battery storage potentially, but right now what the model has selected are combustion turbines to fill that need. Really flexible resources, but they have an incredibly low capacity factor, meaning they're not turning on very often. They're there to meet the needs of the system when you hit those high peaks, when there's contingencies and something else isn't coming through. And they also act as significantly as an insurance policy for those 3 days in a row that you might get a bomb cyclone in, when the solar isn't operating and either the wind has gone to the point where it's so cold that they don't turn, or you have to freeze off the turbine for a little bit, or the wind isn't blowing. So those are all options that we have to build in order to ensure the robustness of the system, the reliability of the system as we continue to transition through 2030. So next slide, please. The punchline for our customers and for you all. Oh, looks like it's skip one. Slide 9. Oh, something changed in order. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this particular one is the punchline for our customers. I am really excited to say that the plan that we've put forward, we anticipate delivering an 85% carbon reduction by 2030, as well as that's going to consist of 80% of the kilowatt hours that are delivered to our customers come from renewable resources. So Nuria, you were talking about the 100% target that you have for renewables for Boulder. That means 20%. We've got to close the gap on that. Your residents are already doing a brilliant job with their rooftop solar and other activities, as well as the community solar gardens in the area. So that helps even more. But that's something that we're committed to helping you all with through our energy partnership agreement and figuring out how do you close the gap on the remaining portion so that you can achieve those targets and goals that you're looking for. And last but certainly not least, affordability has to be central to the conversation that we're having. We can't just whole hog go for all these transitions and then break the bank, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that even our lowest of low income customers are able to afford the products and services that we are providing because they are life essentials. And so there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle here that we have to consider. It's incredibly complex. As you mentioned, it's tens of thousands of pages of materials and documentation and information and models for lots of different individuals to pour over and look at. But the good news is that this will deliver on what it is that we committed to and more. In addition to that, these targets and goals not only meet and beat the state's greenhouse gas roadmap expectations, but they also meet and beat the Paris Climate Agreement guidelines based off of the studies that we've had done and the analysis that's included in there. So really exciting outcomes for our customers. Let's look on just a little bit of process, which is on the next slide. On how this is going to work. Uh-oh. Somebody switched things around on me. The box slide that was before the one that you were on. Go back to that one. There you go. Okay. So this is the process is going to work at the commission. In our ERP, there are two phases. Phase one is what we've just presented. It's the modeling, the technology, it's looking at the different options. How are we going to evaluate this? What's the forward curve on gas? What's the load forecast that we're predicting between now and 2030? What are the sensitivities that we're going to look at? So really high load forecasts, so assume excessive and really high levels of electric vehicle penetration versus low load forecasts where we don't see a lot of transition. So those are all things that we have to present to the commission in this first package. Individuals, parties, you all, such as the city of Boulder, you come in and you evaluate the data and the information we put forward. What the commission decides in this first phase is what are the benchmarks of what we have to use and the inputs for the modeling once we receive the competitive solicitation bids. They also decide what different models they want to see, what different scenarios do they want to make sure that we are looking at as we bring information back for phase two. Phase two kicks off the RFP process so that third-party developers, as well as Excel and other entities, can bring in bids to fulfill the needs of the generation side. And that goes into the model under the constructs that were decided by the commission in phase one. And then we come to an outcome and an answer that then tells us, okay, what is this going to cost? What are the reliability metrics? And what's the ideal mix associated with the different resources that are added? So I mentioned before, we put forward a proposed plan that was based off of generic pricing. That pricing is obviously going to be wrong when it comes to the actual bids that we receive from the various developers. Historically, we've been very fortunate that the developers' bids have actually beat the generic pricing. And so that can determine the volumes of the different resources that we add in. So even though I said 2,300 megawatts of wind, if the bids come in really favorable, it could be 25, 27. If they're not as favorable, it could be 2,000 or 1,800. Same thing for solar. And those things are going to balance out in order to still achieve, though, a minimum of an 80% carbon reduction by 2030. But the numbers are going to move around a little bit. And that will be determined based off of the actual bids that come into the system. So we look forward to seeing that in phase two. Phase two won't kick off until probably tail end of Q2 next year. So in 2022, the end of Q2, and it will take the remainder of the year to go through that process and ultimately get to a decision from the commission for the execution. In the meantime, I mentioned the transmission power pathway. That will go through the remainder of this year and probably early next year get a decision on whether or not we should construct that power pathway. And then if that approval comes through, then we will move into construction for the remainder of 2022. So that when the commission makes the decision at the end of the day on which resources are going to be built, we already have made progress on the power pathway. And so those resources can come online ideally within that 18 to 24 month window, but then also staggered throughout the remaining timeframe when we have the loads and resources retiring off the system and needing the new resources added. So that's a lot going into, the process over the next several months and years, quite frankly. But that's how we go through the resource planning process to make sure we have resource adequacy, but we're also making a very significant transition during this time frame. So let's go to the graph slide that you had up real quick. And this will show you kind of the trajectory that comes with the transition according to the preferred plan we put forward. And you can see what's happening with the blue bars. It's showing the percentage of renewables delivered to our customers. And you'll see that 55% I was mentioning before in that 25 to 26 timeframe has moved up a little because we anticipate new renewable resources coming in as part of this plan and being online, we think, tail end or in sometime in 25, but we think possibly even in 24 a little bit. But you can see the trajectory of the renewables in the blue, and we hit that 80% in 2030. You can see what's happening with the coal in the black bars as it's tapering down significantly to about 4% of our overall energy production. And then you can see the natural gas as well as what's happening with it. It's coming down significantly from where we are currently or where we were in 2020 as well into the 2030 timeframe of being roughly around that 16% of the kilowatt hours delivered. And think of those hours as the hours where the wind and the solar is not available, or we're at minimum load in order to be able to make the transitions between when the wind and the solar are available during the day. So some pretty significant shifts to our overall system. This is a dramatic change from where we've been over the past several decades. And this is taking not only operational expertise to get there, but also significant modeling and technology advancements. But this is also not the end game. We're continuing to look at how do you transition to getting to the zero carbon system by 2050. And that's a strong focus because we need investment, technology, and time now being focused on that and looking at what can we possibly do in order to make that transition and get there even faster. Because I would love to see us get there before 2050, but that's entirely contingent on how do we get the technology to advance fast enough, as well as customers to respond in ways, because this is a two-way street, but for customers to respond in ways that allow us to avoid even more of that carbon production by varying some of their consumption. So there's a lot left in order for us to talk about here, but I think we should truly be proud as a state that we're making these transitions, that we're setting an example for the rest of the country on how to look at it and what you can possibly do, as well as pushing the envelope, quite frankly, on that technology side from the physics perspective of making sure that we have a highly reliable system while we're driving these carbon reductions as well as the renewable adds to the system. So with that, I am happy to take some questions. I know I've dumped a lot on you today, and there's many more details we could go into. There are many different weeds and turns and corners we could take, but suffice it to say, we continue to be here to listen. This is the first cut at an opportunity and the options that we see as being viable. We feel like this is a balanced approach to start from for us to take a look at. And we really look forward to people's feedback and figuring out what is this going to look like as we continue the transition. So with that, I'll pause.
Okay, thank you, Alice. That's a very detailed presentation. I appreciate it. I think we should start with questions from council before any comments. Sam, I believe you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Mark. And Alice, thank you so much for being here. I plan to get in the weeds a little bit, so but I'll start up high and say this is a very different conversation than conversations we've been having 2 or 3 years ago. So I want to say and acknowledge that this is a huge step forward in the past several years, and Excel has played a big part in that. So I think it's important to start there and level set that we are talking about doing much better than we had before. And now I'm going to push a little harder on some details, if that's all right. If we could go to slide, I think it's slide 7. It's the one that shows the new resources that are going to be added. I'm cheating. I actually have some tables up from the ERP filing and wanted to talk to you about why the preferred plan that Excel is offering up is not the one that does the most carbon reduction. So there are 8 scenarios, one of which is the current status quo, and the other 7, which I'm looking at. I'm just going to describe it briefly for other council members. And the preferred scenario is about an 84% emissions reduction over 2005. And there are some below that, but there are also a bunch above that. There's one in particular that I think our community would love to talk more about, which is scenario 2, which has an 88% emissions reduction. It retires both Pawnee and Comanche and stops coal burning then, and then there's a bunch of impacts on that. And so first, what I want to ask Alice is, you've got these scenarios and behind them is a model for each of the scenarios. Is it possible for us to understand the other scenarios that aren't even shown here? So in other words, these show about 400 megawatts of storage new. What did the scenarios that show 800 megawatts of storage and the concurrent reduction of natural gas? So the big question here is, we'll drill into that one scenario in a bit, but when you came up with these scenarios, what about all the ones that aren't here? Like, what is it possible for community members or our staff to be able to look at the scenarios that you did not present in the ERP?
So the ones that are, so just to be really clear, the to my testimony in the case, there are a number of attachments, and those attachments give you the details as far as the different resource additions for the scenarios that are presented. The reason that we narrow down to these scenarios is because the others are immaterially different, and these were the most effective ones for us to bring forward in those manners. Also, through the discovery process of which you are involved in because you are a party to the case, you can ask additional questions that bring forward, other options or, opportunities to look at different pieces of the puzzle. But Sam, if you're specifically asking about the scenarios that are like here, Commission, are the different, corners of the boxes, if you're looking at how do you stress it, what are the different options that you want to look at, those are all included in extensive detail in those attachments. The reasons, and then if you go to the testimony of John Welch and of Jim Hill, Jim Hill's testimony talks about why, whenever we're looking at the different models and the different scenarios that you run initially, why some of them then drop off the list, and how the ones that we presented then covered the various pushes and pulls of those other opportunities or those other scenarios. But you have to cut it off somewhere. Otherwise, there's an infinite number of presentations that you would have to make.
Sure. And so I'll ask about another variable then, discount rate. So, one of the things I'm interested in seeing is for a given discount rate, why did you narrow down? You can say I narrowed down because of price or however you narrowed it down. But the discount rate that's used typically in these scenarios is about 7%. What a discount rate is, for those listening, is how much do I devalue a dollar in a future year that I spend on, say, fuel versus if I spent it today. And so the devaluing is done at 7%, which is much greater than inflation. So it makes future costs look like they are less today than maybe some other people would think they are. So another question about scenarios is, do you have a bunch of runs at different discount rates, or did you just run everything at 7%? And would it be possible to get access to scenarios run at lower discount rates, which tend to favor renewables and storage?
Yeah, so I don't know, Sam, for sure if we had additional runs at other discount rates. I don't remember that through the process. But once again, that's a great discovery question to put in to see if there's a different look. Usually that one's not too terribly hard to update in the modeling to get a better look at what those impacts are. And so that's one that I think that you should put in that direction and take a look at. The discount rate is typically set at the cost of the dollar for the utility, which is usually the WACC. It's what's been used in the past resource plans. And so we've been consistent with it.
Yep. And it would be interesting to see other options, because that discount rate, as you know, materially affects the scenarios that you then look at and call cost effective. So
yeah. Sorry, I would say one other thing, though, is we're getting to the point that we've hit a tipping point of the availability of the generation, because we've moved to the 8760 modeling. And for those of you who are less familiar, 8,760 hours in a year, we used to model one peak hour in order to determine, the resources that are needed on the system. Now we have to model all 8,760 because the variable energy resources have different patterns depending upon what season you're in. And so I think the deciding factor at this point, Sam, isn't going to be so much as the cost impacts of picking a different resource. It's really the availability of the kilowatt hours to fulfill the hours of need and the hours where we don't have that generation. And then it's a cost comparison between batteries and either CTs or an alternative resource. And so that's then where I'll tell you what we need is we need to figure out how do you get more hours out of battery storage, as well as how do you get more years of service. So right now it's 7 to 9-ish years, and then you have to replace that battery. I think that would be a better change in order to get more of those types of resources versus having to revert to a CT or some other fossil-based generation.
Absolutely agree. And absolutely, that would lead into my next question. So I'll get out of the weeds here in a bit, but my next question would be, what's your storage price curve, right? Because you may take that from NREL. How does that compare with others? Because it, as I look at your 7 scenarios going forward, you've got essentially the same amount of storage. You've got exactly the same amount of distributed storage. You've got exactly the same amount of utility scale solar. And then your wind varies a little bit. and your additional combustion turbines that burn natural gas, a powerful global warming gas, goes up. And so the reason I'm kind of pushing on this is we're close, and your 88% scenario is really good. So why don't we go in that direction? And why don't we push on more storage to push down the combustion turbines? Because you could get to, I believe, what you talked about is your 100% renewable goal by 2035, say. Now, it is a cost issue, but I guess I'm pushing back a little bit on the combustion turbine purchases, because I understand they fill that last hour's need on the coldest, darkest, least windy day, but so can batteries. And so to what extent can we push hard on getting batteries, and how can we make sure that the cost of carbon emissions and methane emissions reflects the price we're all going to have to pay, and really the next generation is going to have to pay more than us. So I do appreciate what you've done. I do want to push on all those variables to push for more carbon reduction. I understand that retiring Pawnee and Comanche 3 will be a little painful, but doing those in the 2028 and 2029 timeframe that you list in one of these scenarios would move us beyond coal as fast as we need to. We could know when we're going to close our last coal plants. And so it seems to me, and I think our staff will lobby for anything we can do to get to the higher range of this carbon emissions reduction. But I think all those things that we've just been bouncing around in the weeds all lead into that. And so I just want to take the chance to encourage you in that direction. And also, you talk about needing new technologies in order to get here. I kind of agree and kind of disagree. Under the firm dispatchable, there need to be some new technologies, but to the extent that you can increase batteries and therefore increase wind and solar and other renewables, you can reduce those combustion turbine purchases, because my fear is those become stranded assets. But 10 years from now, we end up paying for 30 years of a combustion turbine that we only used for 10. And so this is a great start. I want to say thank you again for it, but I think we should push really hard, because this is our one bite at the apple for the next few years. And so let's try and get the plan right and not lock ourselves into technologies that will end up stranded. So I'll stop there. I don't want to dig around in the weeds too much, but I think it's important to acknowledge that Boulder loves this start and wants to see, as quick as we can, get off of coal. So.
Yeah, well, Mayor, this is exactly why I love coming and speaking with you all and hearing your viewpoints, because you're touching on things that we challenge the team internally on. Is why isn't there more battery storage in here? And we had to dig into that. And so it's something that we are definitely looking towards. We put in the lowest cost curves that are available in the US, and it didn't change the number substantially. And so that's where, it's like, okay, there's another problem that we're having to solve for that's not selecting that battery storage to come in. But I too agree with you. I am concerned that if we have to install too many of the CTs to meet the reliability needs of the system, we end up with some form of stranded asset in the future. And so that's why we're trying to balance this out. That being said, if we get phenomenal pricing on the battery storage when it comes to the RFP process, it'll win the day, right? Because then it's not just the price curve that the model is using, it's the actual bids and the prices that are coming in from other parties. And that's going to change those numbers. It's going to change the carbon, expectation that we have. And so that's something that we're excited in looking at. It's about setting this model up correctly, so that whenever we do get those RFP bids, it has the flexibility to give us those outcomes. So yes, thank you for the feedback. I really appreciate it. I understand, and I fully expect to continue to be pushed as we try and figure out what's the right outcome here.
All right, I see Mary's hand is up. Erin, I think you had yours up.
So thank you, Alice. And I appreciate that 1 year has gone by since we first began those conversations and that we are at this point. I have 3 questions. My first question has to do with the beginning of your presentation when you were pointing out how the transmission in terms of renewables is where the challenge is. And that's what then becomes the bottleneck, if you will, in time. what occurred to me as you were going through that is that seems to be a kind of for lack of a better term, old school sort of transmission using those old kinds of wires. And I'm wondering, what role do microgrids play in your ERP?
No, it's a good question. Thank you. And the microgrid piece, it solves the reliability of some local areas, and you can have on-site the distributed generation located in those various microgridding areas. But you still need, because of the prevalence of where you build the most robust, the lowest cost wind and solar, it's located on the Eastern Plains. If you pull up the wind speed map of the US, or you look at the solar intensity map of the US, those are the locations where you can get some of the lowest costing resources for customers. But it's not just that resource that we need. It's also the ones in the distributed areas. That's what the 1,300 megawatts that I was talking about contains. And those are the areas where you have more opportunities for, some of that islanding, some of the microgridding, for the reliability, and other opportunities for customers that have higher intense needs for consistent high voltage electricity needs. So that's where those fall. It doesn't necessarily come through an electric resource plan process. That is more of a process that goes on as standalone with the communities. I think it's an item we have on our list in our energy partnership agreement to evaluate and look at in the Boulder area. And so we'll continue to pursue those, but they don't typically come through the electric resource planning process.
Thank you for that. And then I was really happy to hear about how you will be working for a just transition and working with communities that are whose jobs are displaced from the closure of coal plants, and that you would be doing it concurrently. You mentioned that you would be asking the communities what they want. And so my question is how much of what they may ask for, the communities, is within your power and or purview to address?
No, another great question. And I'll use Hayden as the specific example. So we've been working with the community of Hayden since late summer last year to talk to them specifically about what is it that you would want in a transition, because that was the most obvious coal asset that we were going to be accelerating the time frame for retirement. And so we needed to look at not only the jobs at the plant, but the tax base, because we fulfill a significant portion of not only the town of Hayden's tax base, but also the counties. So our first question to them was, do you want a shorter term solution, a longer term solution, an energy-based solution, a jobs-based solution? How do you want us to focus our time? And they asked us for a couple of things. First off, they are very concerned about the tax-based opportunities, because it pays for, as you know, in your own community, many of the different facilities and services and needs that the community has. But the other piece that they told us is they said, we want you to really focus on how you can repower this location so that you don't interrupt the fabric of our community. And what that means is it's not just about job count. It's about job quality and type, so that the individuals that work at the plants or at work at the mines in the area have the same opportunity to stay in the community, because they don't want them moving away. So when we did that, we started looking at, if you were to use and repurpose the 1,500 acres at the Hayden facility, what options do we have? And we put together a package of options that we visited with them about, that range from a wildlife fish hatchery, which, as you know, is not going to have very much tax base or many jobs, but it's something that the community loves. And there isn't a fish hatchery in the area, yet they are, have significant tourism funds and revenues that come from fly fishing. So it's something that will help their community from that perspective, but it doesn't necessarily replace a significant number of the jobs that would be displaced, but it's just something that they like. But all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum of we're currently working on looking at a molten salt battery storage facility. And Mayor, to your point about we need more batteries on the system, and to my point about I have a problem with just 4 hours of duration, these types of batteries give us closer to 10, possibly even 12. And it can reutilize some of the facility there. It takes a lot of technology of the operators that already live in the area, so that fabric of community can be maintained. But then we also looked at what are the other options. We all know that we have another problem that we have to solve, which is the carbon content of our gas pipes. We're looking for areas to do a hydrogen electrolysis process. And yes, Sam, it is based off of renewable energy using to generate that hydrogen, but then to put that into the gas pipeline to blend and to bring down the carbon content of the pipeline. And then last but certainly not least, one of the other problems that's consistent in the area that we've had to work on for years is wildfire. And how do you do wildfire mitigation, forestry management, and looking at the different options. There's great rail service into Hayden because of the fact that we've had to ship coal into that area for a long time. So how can we repurpose those particular lines? And we're looking at figuring out how do we build a combustion opportunity where you take the mountain pine beetle kill, you ship it from around the state via rail into the Hayden area, you combust it into a gas and you put that in the pipeline. We've been looking at science. I personally have visited with professors at different universities to talk about what is the methane emission from decomposition versus combustion and using it in a pipeline? And can you get decreased carbon content from that life cycle opportunity? The answer that we've received is yes. We also have one of the reasons that mountain pine beetle kill hasn't been moved out of our forests as much in Colorado is because there isn't anyone currently willing to pay for that fuel to be moved out. They don't have anywhere to put it. And so if we can figure out how we can solve some of these problems, now that's the most complicated one for us to address, but addresses, and if we did all of these solutions, which we have space and ability to do on this property, it would then allow us to not only replace the tax base and the jobs, but it would actually increase them in the community of Hayden. So these are the solutions we're looking for. Now, what I will tell you is it's not cheap. So I've been on the phone with various agencies in order to try and figure out where can we get outside funding to come in, whether they're grants, zero interest loans, from either federal agencies. We put in an FOA to ARPA, so we're really trying to figure out how do we drive this transition, but at the same time support the communities that are impacted. So hopefully that gives you just a rough picture of how we're rounding this out. We have a community program and a community advisory group that we speak with on a regular basis, keep them updated on what's going on, receive ideas from them for different things that we need to be doing. And they'll be intimately involved in any of the process that we go through for whether it's loans or it's grants in order to make this successful. So we are working really hard to try and figure out how can we do this. This investment, if we are successful, would be, it's a 40-year opportunity. So it's not something that then the community has to go, okay, this band-aided us for 5 years. And now we have to turn around and do something else then. This gives them a longer trajectory for opportunities in the community to figure out what this is going to look like. And so I hope you hear I'm excited about it. There are pieces of the puzzle, of course, that we're going to have to continue to work on, and there's a long road for us to continue, but it's definitely a solution that we can get behind and figure out how do we move that forward.
Thank you very much for that answer. I appreciate it. And finally, in our next discussion, we're going to be talking about systems change and the role that governments, the private sector and non-governmental organizations play in that systems change, and how, what the levers are for each of those sectors. And so I'm wondering how you plan to align your planning to a systems-focused approach, such as what will be presented to us tonight. And so I guess the short question is will you align your strategies to be more systems changed according to what will be presented to the way that the city will be moving forward?
Yeah, so I have to admit, I haven't looked at the presentation following this one. I'm not sure, exactly what's in there. But what I can tell you is that from the energy sector perspective, when you look at things like the greenhouse gas roadmap and what we have to do to achieve the deep carbon reductions across the industry, not just the electric industry. The electric industry is what the majority of the other pieces are built on. And so we are the backbone of figuring out how to do this. And I think that we've done a remarkable job thus far. We're not at the finish line, but we've done a remarkable job thus far of figuring out how do we start changing our areas to align with what has been happening in the others. Feedback from our communities has been paramount. Conversations that we've had with Boulder, other communities in the state of Colorado have already started that, what I call systems change for us. But as we then look at the transportation sector, it's dependent on us being successful here. As we start looking at the building sector and figuring out how do we continue to drive down carbon emissions and, quite frankly, energy consumption in those very buildings, how are we going to do that on the backs of, a successful outcome in this particular sector? I would advocate that I believe that the reason that we've been successful in Colorado, or more successful in Colorado, is not just because my company, but it's because of the way that we have our energy system focused and the communities that we have that are pushing us to do better. And so I think that we're on the way. It's not the finish line, but it's something that we'll have to keep moving on. And I'll make sure I take a look at the presentation, and I'm happy to discuss with you more specifics about where the city's going, as I become more educated on the systems changes you're going to be putting in place.
Well, thank you very much. And I would appreciate, some perusal of, I believe it was a second attachment, if you want don't want to have to read the whole memo. But I think that that's the key to addressing the larger challenge of climate change. So thank you, Alice. And I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Rachel, you have your hand up.
I do. Thanks, Mark. Hi, Alice. Hi, everyone. Sorry, my camera is not available to be on tonight. So thanks for bearing with me on that. And thanks, Alice, for the presentation. Kind of following up, I think, a little bit on what Mary's getting at. I'm personally not able to, I guess, wax Excel the way that Sam is, and I appreciated all of those questions. But wondering, I guess it feels like we have a lot of different moving parts, and one is what we are doing internally as a city in the presentation we're going to get next from staff. And I assume that you and our staff talk a lot, but we're not really privy to those conversations. So I just wanted to know, sort of maybe from staff, if that is appropriate to ask, what questions they might have about your presentation, or sort of what our resident experts might be wondering. And so wanted to ask Nuria if that's appropriate, if staff have any follow-up questions, or can sort of tell us what questions maybe they've been pressing on with Excel behind the scenes.
Sure, and I appreciate the question, Rachel. I know that staff have been working really hard in partnership with Alice and her team as well. I'll defer to Jonathan or to Carolyn if they want to jump in at this juncture, but I will say that following up on Mary's conversation, that we're actually taking advantage, and Alice is graciously sticking around for our next presentation as we talk about some of the partnership activities that have taken place. So you'll hear a little bit about from Carolyn about the staff side of the partnership that has taken place. And then we have both staff from our city and staff from Excel who are open and willing to continue to talk about those activities that are taking in concert. But certainly defer to Carolyn and Jonathan if there are specific questions they want to bring now, or even items that they have been already bringing to Excel and want to share with council in terms of things that they're looking at more closely.
Thanks, Nuria. Good evening, council members. I'm Jonathan Cohen, the interim director of the Climate Initiatives Department. Alice, thank you for your presentation, and council members. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the electric resource plan. Obviously, this is a topic that's really important, not just in terms of our partnership with Excel, but as it feeds into the next conversation, I think, as Councilmember Young really referenced, what does the system level change look like, and how does energy really fit into that model? And so I will commit, obviously, with Alice and our team and her team to really talk a little bit about how we're presenting that systems level approach, what that means in the energy sector. I think the questions that our team has had on the ERP filing, I think are in line with some of the questions that that the mayor asked. I think that there will most certainly be some elements of the proposal we're supporting, as Nuria said in her open remarks. I think there are still some questions that we'll want to dig a little bit deeper on, Alice, as you suggested, during discovery as we move forward. And I think it's really important to recognize that the Clean Energy Plan is not a single thing to collectively support or not. It includes a number of proposals, of resource proposals. And the backstop of those proposals is really Senate Bill 236 and thinking about how our state is going to achieve the 80% emission reduction versus 2005 levels and moving towards the 100% clean energy resources by 2050. Really appreciated you hitting the piece about the gap. That's a really critical piece for our community to be thinking about. What does it look like to fill that gap between where Excel believes it will be in 2030 and where our community has set its sights to achieve 100% renewable electricity in 2030. So we'll want to explore that a little bit more deeply to understand the tools that we have available to us and how we can wield the partnership as a tool to be able to fill that gap. And so I know we're running a little bit behind on time. And so I really welcome the opportunity to dig in deeply with Alice, your team, through the partnership. I think, as you'll see in the next presentation, that we're setting up a nice architecture to be able to bring these kind of questions forward. And I just really want to make sure that this is a beginning of a dialogue with our community. I think there are a number of questions that very smart people in our community have about the ERP and how we move this forward, and how we as a city who is a party to the ERP can bring forward those voices in the process later on this year. So let me just turn to Carolyn. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you, Jonathan. I think the only thing I would offer is I think we'll have a better idea of the schedule around the ERP. That calendar will be posted towards the end of this month. And so I think at that point, we'll be able to set up some conversations with the community to get broader feedback that will help inform staff's response and our input into the ERP as a whole. And so more to come for sure on that as we get clarity around this upcoming schedule for the whole litigation process.
Okay. I do not see any further hands for questions. Any comments from council before we move on? Going once, twice. Nuria, I'm turning it back to you for our next item.
Great. And I think we've transitioned really well into the next item. And I just appreciate Alice again for giving us a run through of what I believe I promised would be a sort of a dense and a lot to unpack presentation. But staff also thought it'd be useful to give council a brief update on the City Excel partnership activities. So you're going to hear there's a lot in motion. I know that we're intended to give you a high level overview, but thought I also put some context for those perhaps that are watching us from home and are new to the process. Boulder voters approved a new franchise agreement with Xcel Energy just last November in 2020. And by passing that, they also approved a new partnership between the city and Xcel Energy. The partnership agreement seeks to make significant progress on Boulder's clean energy and climate goals. And under this deal, the city and Xcel are working together on a modern grid planning partnership, really aimed at helping the city achieve that 100% renewable electricity goal by 2030. So Carolyn from the Climate Initiatives Department is going to give that presentation, and both staff from our city and Xcel are available for questions. So without anything further, I will pass that on to Carolyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Nuria. Thank you, Mark and Council. Again, I'm Carolyn Elam. I'm the Energy Manager in the Department of Climate Initiatives. I'm also serving as our Partnership Manager on behalf of the city, and joined by my counterpart from Xcel, Iffy Jennings, who's serving to manage the day-to-day relationship. And so I just wanted to provide a brief update to you. I did have the opportunity to talk with all of you towards the end of February to talk about our work to stand up the partnership. And so these are just a few highlights of where we're at in the last several months. To the next slide. Actually, we'll skip that one. Next slide. And I could come back to that if we have some questions. But I think I want to just talk specifically about how we really take what was conceived in the energy partnership and move it into projects. I think everybody was familiar with what we called the Project A and B list that was attached to the energy partnership as part of those agreements. Those projects, many of them were highly conceptual in nature, others were more discrete in nature. So our team has been working really hard to take each and every one of those and provide greater color and clarity to them. Really, what did they mean? Where are they? Are they a feasibility study? Are they something really ready to hit the ground? And start to really flesh out what those work teams need to be, what those work plans need to be, and starting to prioritize those so that we are ready when we launch our advisory panel and our community engagement this summer, which I'll talk about some more in a minute. That we really have enough color to really have an informed discussion around those. And so that's really the process we've been in. And I'll give you a few highlights of where we're at on those specific projects. But we are standing up some project teams to really flesh those out. And it's been a really productive partnership discussions. And I think we're really looking forward to also diving into how the ERP may support some of those projects as well as it moves through the process. Again, we will be taking these as everything's an iterative process, working with the community, our executive committee, our advisory panel to really iterate, socialize, design, and move these forward. And so there'll be a lot more conversation about the projects as they really start to emerge from this kind of visioning and scoping process that we're in right now. Next slide. So I'm not going to walk through all of this in the interest of time. We certainly are happy to share this, and I'm happy to dive into any specific projects. But this is really what we call the project A and B list consolidated now with some highlights of where we're at. We've largely been these into ones focused on electrifying transportation, our buildings, and cleaning up our electricity supply, improving the reliability of the system that's in place within our community, really enhancing kind of the customer side renewable and efficiency programs so that we're really maximizing the benefit for our community locally, and the overall benefiting our community, centering our equity goals, seeing how we can put new programs in place to help our community as they seek to improve their own reliability, and really how we improve our overall relations. We know that Excel is really ramping up some work in our community, and we're having some bumps and growing pains that go along with that, but we really want to center our outreach into the community and make a strong reach as we work through this partnership. So just a few highlights. Again, you'll see projects here like Chautauqua, where we have a great sustainability plan in place. We're now trying to vision that into what that looks like in terms of discrete projects that stand up that energy plan. You'll see our work on grid modernization, really starting to scope out what that system looks like, where our points of interface are going to be. And so there's a few, and again, I'm happy to talk through any of these more specifically. But I'll go to the next slide and really talk about one that we really want to highlight that's underway. That we're all extremely, I think, excited to see is our first 1% undergrounding project, which is actually underway now. This project is being done as part of the North Broadway reconstruction project that our transportation department is leading. And we're roughly undergrounding the segment that runs from Violet up to Highway 36. So that will take down that large segment. We know that this has been a priority area for the community, both in terms of improving our reliability, as well as facilitating some improvements within that area. So this project is underway and will wrap up later this year, and it'll represent the first undergrounding. We're also starting to work through potential future projects as well and really understand what our reliability improvements could be. And our plan continues to be to publish a overall 5-year visioning plan for undergrounding later this year. Next slide. This is one I really am very excited to talk about, which is really standing up our community advisory panel. When I talked to council and the community back in February, we were just launching this process. We had 94 applicants, amazing applications from folks throughout our community, both our business sector and our residential sector. We narrowed that down and talked with just over 30 of them through an interview process and narrowed down on our 18 members who we've selected, really representing a diversity of experiences. Again, this advisory panel is really representing the customer experience side of the equation. So really bringing how their utility interacts with them and really representing that segment of our community as they provide input to us. We will have our first kickoff with the panel. We're targeting late June. We're actually bringing on a facilitation organization to make sure that we're hugely successful. And then we'll start to really ramp up that process during the latter half of this year. Next slide, please. You know, we've heard a lot from our community as well. We have an amazing set of thought leaders that really in addition to our advisory panel, we want to hear from in a structured way and really provide them the opportunity to feedback. So we are envisioning a number of working groups. I want to highlight one that I know is extremely important to our community, and it's actually more than one working group and more than one process, but we really are looking to ramp up our engagement this summer around our 100% renewable electricity goal. I think as we heard Alice talk about, we know that we're going to have a little bit of a gap between where Excel is going to be even in their best scenario and where our goal is. And we really need to start diving into how we're going to set our targets, make sure we're tracking progress and envisioning this. So really working with our community as a whole to understand really what does 100% renewable electricity truly mean? What are the values that underline that? We often talk about this as synonymous with greenhouse gas emissions reduction, but we know that that's not necessarily true. So really diving into that conversation, standing up multiple working groups to really vision and prioritize some of our solutions, vet those through our advisory panel, and then some of those will turn into partnership projects that we work on with Excel. And we envision some will be ones that the city takes the lead on because we're better suited to do that independently. And so I just wanted to offer that as something that the community can expect to hear from us very shortly on as we start to launch that process and call for input. And then my final slide, I also wanted to talk about our first public kickoff event, which we haven't scheduled yet. I'm really excited to hear where our COVID numbers are going and the opportunity to potentially do our kickoff event in person or at least in a more hybrid setting. And so as we get a handle on that, we'll be announcing that the date, the venue, and the format. This will really be the opportunity for the panel, for the community at large to meet our panel, interact with our executive team and our project oversight teams. We'll be able to deep dive into some of the projects so the community can learn a lot more detail than I can present tonight, as well as provide opportunity to provide public input. Again, this is separate from even the deep dive we've talked about on the ERP input, but this is broadly over the partnership. So with that, I will stop and take any questions from council.
Well, I see no hands at the moment. Any takers? All right. Does that conclude your presentation, or?
It does, thank you.
Any comments from council? All right, very good. Thank you for that presentation. It was illuminating, to say the least. And I think that means we are down to our last item in the agenda for this evening. Nuria, take it away.
Thank you, Mark. And we're going to round out the trifecta of all updates on climate initiatives today with an update on the Climate Action Plan. It's no secret, right, that the world is at a really critical point in confronting the climate crisis. Boulder, and I really mean the broader Boulder, our city organization, city council, but truthfully our entire community have been longstanding leaders in this arena. And as city-led climate action is evolving and shifting to address the challenges ahead, it's been exciting in my short time here to learn more about how our staff is approaching the work and how they're doing some really deep thinking on how to continue to be effective in this work with that is having a changing paradigm over time. So tonight you're going to hear some new proposed goals that address the latest science, the city's approach to developing a strategy for the next generation of climate action work, and ways in which our community will be brought together with renewed urgency to achieve our goals. So with that, I'm really going to send this to Jonathan to continue to frame this and his team for their presentation. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Nuria, so much. Well, good evening, Mayor and Council, and good evening to our community members watching tonight's discussions. It's honestly a privilege to have this time with you. I know we've had a dense conversation already tonight, and so we'll try to just continue the momentum. Again, I'm Jonathan Cohen, the Interim Director of the Climate Initiatives Department. We are scheduled for roughly 90 minutes or so, but we have a staff presentation we'll try to get through as quickly as possible, knowing we're running a little behind. But it's a big topic too. So there's several questions for council that were provided in your packet. We'll have them on a slide near the end so that can guide the conversation. Giving much of tonight's presentation from our Climate Initiatives team, our Senior Policy Advisor, Brett Concairn, who's in right now, and Senior Energy Project Manager, Yael Gashan. So just to frame this a little bit, Brett's going to cover some of the key insights from our department's work. Really, over the past 2 years specifically, he'll talk about the challenges and insights related to our local climate work and the evolving role of cities in addressing the climate crisis. Yael then is going to pick up from there and talk about the proposed revisions to our community-based goals and targets, specifically the next several months of work we have outlined in your packet. So before we get going, I have to do what I always do, and I want to extend a little bit of appreciation specifically to our exceptional team in the climate department. Many are here tonight to address any questions, and I have honestly believed that our community is fortunate to have such a dedicated group of bright and driven staff. I've also really been overjoyed at the commitment and collaboration among the city departments on this critical issue. Of course, I need to acknowledge the tireless work of so many in our community and the leadership, of course, from council on this issue year after year. Finally, the last thing I want to say here is I have to recognize this is the first of hopefully many climate-based conversations with Nuria as our new city manager. So before we bring in the presentation, I'm going to tempt fate a little bit by relying on technology. Last time we were with you on this topic, you might recall we had I think a skit and some songs by the Young Women's Climate Theater Group. This time, we're going to start with a short video. So let's see if this works. All right, well, we got part of it anyway. We're just going to roll with it. What we will do is post this on our website, and I'll send this out so council can see it. The reason that we wanted to show this video, and one of the things I really liked about it, at least the parts that we saw tonight, is that it illustrates that climate action takes on a lot of forms. Meaning you don't have to be a climate scientist or an energy expert to take meaningful action on climate. The point of the video is to show that our residents, our businesses, our youth, our artists, our athletes, musicians, individuals, neighborhoods, they continue to recognize that climate is one of the most salient issues of our time. So the past 15 years or so of commitment from our community have driven local carbon emissions 21% below where they were in 2005. So those reductions to date, I think, are especially impressive given the growth of more people and more jobs during the same period. So that's good news. That momentum is encouraging, and it's important to celebrate our successes and recognize the effectiveness of our efforts and investments. But it's equally important to be honest about the risk of what I describe as a shallow transition. And that's one where we address some specific problems and their symptoms in isolation, but we really don't tackle the root causes. And unfortunately, the past few years have also been a stark reminder that climate changes are already occurring and they're going to continue to occur, which means that both resilience and equity have to become core design considerations. So before I turn this over to Brett, I just want to say that tonight is really calling for three things. First is what I described as a reset of our ambition. So in the memo, we talk a lot about a bold new climate vision, and it's clear that this coming decade is going to require a suite of fundamental transitions in our key systems. So if we're going to create the conditions in which people and planet thrive, then we need to start designing for a just and regenerative future. And we need to challenge everyone in our economy and society to examine what their role in creating that future looks like. The second thing is we want to focus on ensuring just transitions. Mary, you picked up on this thread in the earlier conversation. While there is this resonance in being bold right now, we recognize that climate is a threat multiplier. So while we're prioritizing a better understanding of vulnerabilities and how we can best support those that are most impacted, put simply, we live in an equitable society, which means that burdens that are created by climate change are not felt equally. We're starting to recognize the intersections of climate change, race, and systemic inequities. And so as we move forward, we're committing to ensuring that equity is at the core of our work to reduce our climate impact and prepare our whole community for the changes ahead. Yeah, I was going to pick up on thread and give you some examples about how we're putting that into practice. And the third thing about tonight is to make sure that we understand how we are building capacity for systemic and what I call joined up thinking. So to make sure our efforts are long lasting, the memo outlines how we're changing the way we approach problems and solutions within the department and the city. So at a high level, what I mean by that is we're investing a lot in building capacity with our community and enabling change makers. At the same time, we're getting better working across historic silos, those boundaries between businesses and other organizations, public and private sectors, individuals and neighborhoods. I think this helps us acknowledge the interconnections between our environment, human health, and the health of our economy and society. In other words, supporting local climate action is going to have impacts far beyond just climate. So to wrap up, there are huge questions to be tackled, no question, not just here in Boulder, but in virtually every community. So the answers to them may at first seem somewhat out of reach. But the reality is that, like the video showed, organizations and individuals are answering these questions every day in positive and innovative ways. So as I wrap up my comments, I would say that we are eager to share our new approach for the next generation of climate work, including a package of proposed science-based goals, and share ways in which our community can be brought together with a renewed sense of urgency. We think this approach is courageous, we think it's visionary, and we think it's collaborative. So I want to turn it over to Brett, and I will see you when we group at the end of the presentation for question and answers. Thanks. Brett, on to you. Brett, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Good. Is my slide up now?
It is.
Okay, well, now you can hear me. Fantastic. Well, good evening, Council. It's actually just such a delight to see some of you that I haven't seen for a year or more. And thank you all so much for being leaders in this extremely difficult time. I also want to thank and say hello to our community and to actually people that I know are viewing from many other places tonight. Welcome, and we're honored to have you. It is really a huge honor to be here and to represent this department of many bright minds, capable hands, and very exciting ideas that are passionate with all these folks. And but to also note that we are really the reflection and the workers of this community. This community is what has driven climate action for decades, frankly. So I just wanted to say thank you, and to our community who's been so invested in this. I hope that you'll see yourself in the work that we're describing tonight. And finally, I also just want to acknowledge that we live on and carry on from the traditions of many others, that we the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Ute who lived here before us, who worked so hard to figure out a sustainable life in their context, and that there's much in those living traditions that we still have to learn from. So tonight I'd like to actually start, though, with a little bit of the legacy that this community has been a part of really for over 100 years. I mean, think about Chautauqua was really a part of this effort to understand the challenges of that time, to think and create institutions that could start to work on that. We carried that through into the 20th century with all the remarkable work that was done around land use, the creation of the open space programs, one of the first walking malls in the country. And then, of course, our commitment to actually starting to work on things like recycling. This is actually one of the first curbside recycling efforts in the country started here. That's the original EcoCycle bus that used to travel around with volunteers picking up our recycling. The remarkable advocacy work that so many residents did around non-nuclear proliferation, our work around fracking, our scientific community that often stands up and makes itself heard, and of course, this decades-long effort to think about a new kind of energy system. In terms of climate action itself, our work is literally now, formally at least, about 20 years old. It was the lack of our countries signing on to, as a nation, the Kyoto Accords in the late 90s that led a few places like Boulder to step forward and say, if our nation won't do it, we'll do it. And we literally helped to spawn a whole new movement of community-based climate action. In 2006, we were one of the first to pass a tax. In fact, I think we were the first to pass a tax on ourselves through our surcharge on electricity that funded our CAP programs, our climate action plan programs. We renewed that every 2 or 3 years because our community was so committed to that. In 2013, our Kyoto-based plan expired, and so we started work on a new plan. That plan was based on the new science that was currently guiding the goals that we have been living under, that said 80% emissions reduction by 2050. But by 2019, we and many other places realized that it wasn't enough and that we had to think through a new approach. And that's when we launched, just prior to COVID, the climate action mobilization process that brought so many people out from our community. We have not been doing this alone. In fact, it's a part of the strength of our work that we have drawn on the expertise and the inspiration and the sort of joint effort of many other cities through networks like the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which is literally a global network. And so we felt like we were building a movement that was intended to actually spread and disseminate this work to many, many other places. But I think now, after 20 years, we have recognized that it's time to reflect on a few of the core assumptions that were at the heart of how we were approaching climate action. One of those assumptions was that if we as a community and a few others could actually start moving out in this way and finding ways that we could reduce emissions and make that kind of accessible to others, that other communities across the country would follow. And then a second major assumption was that as we did that, that aggregated impact of a growing movement of cities would lead to significant reductions in greenhouse gases. And I think now, unfortunately, we recognize that several of those assumptions just didn't appear to be true. So this was a report that was just finished last year by a group called Cityscale that's actually former sustainability officials from many cities around the country that looked at how effectively has this work spread to other communities. And what the data shows is that about 8% of the communities in the country actually have adopted some form of climate action. Now that represents about 30% of the population, because as you'll see, the blue dots represent the places that have made some kind of commitment around climate action. But the red dots, let me give you a little bit closer view. The red dots are all those places that haven't. So somehow our model of how we were doing this, how the beacons on the hill were going to somehow lead to this movement, hasn't resulted in the way we thought. And we've also realized that.
Brett, I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you have slides that we're supposed to be looking at right now?
Oh, I'm so sorry. They're not.
I was seeing slides.
Oh, interesting. I wasn't seeing slides. Okay, I will see what I'm doing wrong. Brett,
Oh no, is
you're
anybody
fine.
else not seeing the slides?
I'm seeing them.
I'm
Okay.
seeing them.
Super. Thank you.
I'm so sorry, Sam.
No, not your fault, obviously. Thank you.
Okay, so what this report that I was just referring to just came out. It's actually a consortium of climate leaders from a variety of different jurisdictions that were looking at what has the collective emissions impact been of this city's movement. And it notes that, yes, it's been an important movement in many ways, but that we aren't seeing that significant accumulation of emissions reduction from this work. And that's not just a few people making that assertion. That's what our science is showing us. So this was the last major report that the UN body of climate scientists, called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued, was in 2018. It was called the Global Warming of 1.5 degrees. And it was the report on how we were doing from the Paris Accords that were passed in 2015 by 197 nations. And basically that report said, we're not going nearly fast enough. And in fact, emissions reduction will no longer be enough to stabilize climate. We now have to start growing very rapidly a carbon drawdown sector. And finally, because we have not moved quickly enough, we have to start preparing our communities for very significant climate change. Unfortunately, that trend that was noted in 2018 has continued. The UN issues a report every year called the Emissions Gap Report that has basically shown that the nationally determined contributions, just the commitments, are themselves not enough, much less the action that's actually taking place. And in the reports that were just issued, they said that we will soon have to be achieving something like a 15% emissions reduction year on year between now and 2030 if we are to achieve that, keeping our warming below that 2-degree threshold. So we know that unfortunately this is creating a climate emergency. And I don't want to dwell on this, but I think that we feel that it's our responsibility and our role as a department to share with you and with our communities where climate change stands and where it's headed. And we know this isn't something that's happening in other places. It's literally happening at our doorstep. In fact, these are photographs from last fall. In fact, the one with the horse trailer is from Carolyn Elam, where she was helping to evacuate horses just north of town. Now, it's interesting in a certain kind of way, though not exciting, that map on the right is a map that I showed council in 2013. It's a map that was produced by the National Academy of Sciences that said, what would be the increase in fire incidents for every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature? And if you look at that portion on the mid-right that says J, 656%. That's the projected increase in fire incident in our territory, in our area, for every 1 degree increase Celsius. And we're starting to see that phenomena take hold. Of course, it's not just things like fire, it's also the things that those fires cause. The terrible smoke conditions we had for weeks are not just temporary inconveniences. These are incidents that cause long-lasting health impacts that we need to start planning for and managing for. And then we just have these kind of wild and sort of unpredictable swings. Last fall, for example, you probably remember October, it's record lows in October 26th, and then a week and a half later, a record high. So I'm going to close this part because I know it's difficult, but important for us to, I think, be honest about where things stand. We are not really prepared for what's coming yet, not just us, but really almost anywhere in our societies yet. This is a report that came out from the Union of Concerned Scientists that was talking about what will the heat conditions be in cities in the mid-century. And it projects that by mid-century, about a third of the communities over 50,000 people in size will be experiencing over 30 days of over 100 degrees in temperature. There are only 3 places in the lower 48 that can experience that now. 2 are in deserts in California and 1 in Arizona. So it's clear that we have to both prepare for what's coming and we have to find more effective strategies to start stabilizing climate. We believe, after consultation with a lot of different places and parties and looking at our own experience, that the fundamental element of this is thinking about it from a systems perspective. There are really 2 areas we think that we need to reconsider our climate action, both the scope of what climate action is and the focus of our actions. So in terms of that scope, like when I joined the city in 2013, climate action was entirely about managing energy systems, decarbonizing our energy systems. It's still obviously extremely important. All those things that we have been doing and need to continue to do more, and all those things that Alice's team will hopefully really put the pedal to the metal on. But now, as we've said, we also have to prepare for the inevitable climate change that's going to take place for decades to come. And as Jonathan was emphasizing, we have to do that in a way that recognizes both the historical inequities and works in every way possible to create an equitable outcome going forward. In terms of resilience, we are already starting to ramp that up in a variety of ways. This is work we're doing with Boulder County to start to take that question of how do we absorb, adapt, and transform these change factors right down to the neighborhood level. And so we will be hearing a lot more about this work in months to come. In terms of resilience itself, it's about in terms of equity itself, it's about integrating core concepts like inclusive representation in all the things that we're doing, equitable distribution of the benefits and costs of what we're doing, funding allocations that recognize the historical inequities and ways that we actually also start to represent the generations to come. Now, there are a few other insights that I just want to review because I think they help us shape about our next steps and where we go. Again, we started with energy systems. That was, and I think we've made in many ways progress. Obviously, what we've been hearing about from Alice tonight is a part of what our community has helped to create. We've also realized, however, that it's not just about energy systems. It's about our material economy, frankly. It's about all the energy and all the other emissions that are embedded in all the stuff that we keep using. But we're also finally realizing too, that it's about how we have managed our ecosystems, not only because our ecosystems are a part of how they bring carbon out of the atmosphere, but because as we deforest and degrade agricultural lands, we actually release a lot of carbon as well. So these have been, and in 2016, we called them out as the 3 primary focus areas of climate action. However, we've come to realize that surrounding those causal factors are other dynamics that hold those causal factors in place. Things like the market, things like the knowledge and technology that's available, things like the policies and laws that basically set the stage, that the rules of the game, and of course, just our norms and culture. So, and all of those are interactive to one another. So that's in some ways good news. You can actually make changes in the market by changing our cultural norms and social behaviors. You can change the way we have knowledge and technology by changing our policies and laws. So now we start to see that these things are interwoven together, that the causal factors of climate change, energy systems, material economy, ecosystems are influenced and shaped by those larger forces. And so what we're suggesting through the presentation and the memo is that we need to start focusing even more, because we have been to some extent, even more on those fundamental systems drivers. So I know that's a little abstract. So let's try to make it more concrete. Let's talk about a particular instance, getting off methane, so-called natural gas. Why do we have this problem? Well, in part because of these system drivers. In markets, for example, methane is cheap. It's cheap for a whole bunch of reasons that have to do with subsidies and other ways that we have made it cheap. That was a priority for our society for a long time. It made a lot of sense, but it no longer makes sense. However, it's still the way the system is working. Knowledge and technology. Let's take the example of how we get our homes off natural gas and onto things like high efficiency heat pumps. We ran an adoption program in 2014. I'll talk a little bit more about, but we soon discovered that there aren't good solutions to all the cases in which we want to change out that natural gas. We need more of that knowledge and technology to do that. In terms of policy, we still have policies that are enabling and supporting the build out of the infrastructure to use methane gas, when if we didn't want that to be used, then we shouldn't be building that infrastructure. And finally, things like norms and culture, like people, you might be one of them, say like, well, I just can't imagine cooking without my gas range. Even though, as you may know, the science and the health analysis recently has been showing that the use of natural methane gas ranges in homes is one of the biggest sources of indoor air pollution that's causing a lot of health problems. So then how would we use a systems approach to actually get at this issue? Well, in terms of the sort of market failure of making methane really cheap, one of the ways is by subsidizing and making more affordable that heat pump technology. So that's what we started to do in 2014 and learned a lot about what it would take to make that heat pump choice the choice that people would make. There's also this issue, again, of getting better solutions in place. So we work with manufacturers like Mitsubishi and have started to actually stimulate them, not only developing new technology, but bringing technologies that they've already developed in Asia or in Europe into our marketplace. In terms of laws and regulations, we need coordinated action to start making the transition to these electric options the way the system works, whether that's massive electric ready work across all the houses to make sure that they have the electrical panels that make it ready, or finding ways that we remove all those tax loopholes and subsidies that are currently making gas cheaper than it should be. And finally, we need to be doing education and outreach and starting to talk about what it really means to continue to use gas and how much healthier we might be if we weren't. So this isn't just about the strategy that the city uses. The argument is actually that there is a systems-based approach for every sector of our society. Now, I'm not going to try to go through each one of those tonight, but I did just want to illustrate this a little bit more by taking one of these sectors. Let's just think about ourselves as individuals. How do we act in a way that actually changes systems? Well, in the case of the market, we have seen very, very significant examples, whether it's apartheid or others, where when individuals start to work together to do boycotts, boycotts, or other forms of investment or disinvestment, that can move markets. It's one of the reasons why coal investments in some places are no longer going forward, because the Bank of England, pressured by its shareholders, said, we aren't going to continue to invest in those. Also, in terms of knowledge and technology, our community is a perfect example of this kind of systems action where people say, you know, I have the resources to be a part of a pilot where I'm going to adopt a new technology that might be a little bit more expensive, or maybe I'm not sure that's going to work exactly the way I want it to, but I know that if we can make this work, it will be a game changer in the broader market. In terms of policy and law, obviously, first step, vote. But there's lots of other levels of how we can engage in that policy process, both locally, state level, and nationally. And finally, in terms of norms and culture, we need to be visible to one another. We need to engage one another both directly face to face, whether it's letters to the editor. We need to have conversations with each other about what we really want. And that includes, by the way, listening well to others who have views that aren't the same as ours. So let's just talk a little bit about what this looks like in practice. And again, we're going to be building on things that we've already been doing, but starting to focus even more in those places. So I would call out one of the really, frankly, game-changing pieces that the city of Boulder and Boulder County initiated about 4 years ago was the Colorado Communities for Climate Action. Up to that point, Boulder and Boulder County, we would sometimes form together to try to have an influence on the state policies. But when we finally realized we need more of our local jurisdictions coming together around this, and we started to say, would you come together? Could we form a common policy agenda? And in fact, started with 5, then 7, then 14, and now it's over 30, I think almost 40 communities around the country, the state, and we are having a significant policy influence at the state level. Legally, you might remember that in 2018, we did this audacious thing along with the county again of filing a lawsuit against Exxon and Suncor. That's in fact a picture from the New York Times from 2018. Well, as it turns out, that was a pretty good strategy that other people are using. And some of you may remember last week, major decisions handed down both in Europe and in here, that's actually putting the oil companies on notice that they are going to have to start making significant changes. In terms of the material economy, we've started to map the flow of resources through our community. On the left, you see all the different ways that resources enter our community. And then it starts to go, where does that go? How can we interrupt that passageway to the dump and turn it back into something we can use in one form or another? I'll give you an example of that. Just today, we announced that we got a $100,000 grant from the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and we're in a finalist in the Bloomberg Philanthropies area to start working on creating a circular economy around woody biomass that comes out of our forests, both urban and wildlands, and that can be then turned into biochar. That biochar then becomes an amendment that we can use in both our urban forestry and soil work to capture more carbon and starts to create this virtuous carbon cycle. In terms of energy, I think you've heard a lot this evening. You can see how, I think, influential Boulder continues to be on Excel, and in that way on the rest of the service territory around a whole bunch of things. In fact, through our partnership, we are going to probably be the first people to start looking at tariff-based financing, a mechanism to spread the costs of these kinds of transitions over longer periods of time, making that much more affordable for a lot more people, and really pushing forward on this electrification. This electrification website that just launched was, again, a consortium of groups that hadn't normally come together, but which are now moving in that kind of systems-based way. In ecosystems, I'm really excited to report we've been doing some very interesting work. We founded a new entity, the City and Urban Sustainability Directors Network formed a new entity called Urban Drawdown Initiative so that we can stimulate this work not only in Boulder, but elsewhere around the country. In that partnership, we have just created a new tool with the Trust for Public Land that will actually enable communities to start doing carbon management within their urban landscapes. And we actually were the ones who helped launch a whole national initiative around scaling up urban forestry as both a climate action, but also as a community recovery and public health initiative. I want to note, by the way, that one of the systems areas that we weren't working on that came out of our community engagement was financial systems and the economy. And so I think most of you know, last week, we launched a 6-month forum called Economy, Climate, and Community, where we're bringing in some of the world recognized leaders in the issues of economy to talk about how we move the economy from being a cause of climate change to being a part of its solution. And then finally, another area that was brought forward by our community is around comprehensive planning, about land use. Now, Land use is one of the favorite contact sports in our community. So we're not going to take on all of land use within the climate action program. But I would say that we are on the path towards one of the major comprehensive plan updates in 2025. This is going to be an extremely important time for us to look at all the ways that planning and land use shape our ability to both reduce emissions, draw down carbon, and prepare our community for all kinds of different climate effects. So it's going to be a very important process, and I expect that a lot of our community will be deeply engaged with that. So with all of this, I just wanted to say we're moving on things we've already been doing, but we're creating opportunities to take that to the next level. And I think one of those important places where you can see how we'll move this forward is in the kinds of goals we set and the kinds of targets that are related to those goals. And with that, I'd like to now turn it over to our colleague, Yael Gishan, to talk about our goals and targets in the process for moving forward.
Thank you, Brett.
Oops, let me just keep sharing screen.
Great. Thank you, Brett. Mayor, members of council and our community, thank you. I'm Yael Gishan, a senior energy project manager in the Climate Initiatives Department. Can you go back one slide? Thanks, Brett. So Brett just walked us through the importance of focusing the city's actions in support of achieving these larger regional and national climate goals. So I want to walk us through how these insights have supported the proposed framework for new goals and targets. Next slide. Sorry. So the science is clear. Brett just did a really good job of explaining that. The amount of carbon that we can emit to remain under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, which is our carbon budget, is limited. We must remain under that 1.5 degrees to avoid the catastrophic levels of warming. And as this graphic shows, we are already at 1.1 degrees. At our current rate of emissions, we will exhaust our carbon budget in about 10 years. So what does this mean for setting targets? It means that we must move quickly. So for even 50% chance of staying 1.5 degrees below, the global emissions need to be cut by almost half by 2030 to reach net zero by 2050. For a likely 66% chance of staying within this carbon budget, the global community must get to net zero about 10 years earlier, by 2035 or 2040. And it's really important to note the equity-related considerations here. So this isn't represented equally across the globe. The higher emitters must move much more quickly and also equitably take responsibility for their part. So based on this, the wealthier, higher emitting regions should really push for more aggressive net zero dates. Next slide. As I just explained, because we're not equally responsible for climate change, the responsibility should be distributed relative to those who are responsible for causing it. The wealthiest 10% of the world's population are responsible for over 50% of the current emissions, whereas the poorest 50% are only responsible for 10% of emissions. Those most responsible must support those most vulnerable to the impacts, so those that are least responsible don't end up having to pay to fix the problems and suffer the consequences. Next. This graph illustrates annual emissions per capita. So you can see that the US is at the top at, in 2017, that data is from 16.2 tons per person. Boulder from 2019 is at 13.7, so not too far behind. And then you can see China, the European Union, the rest of the world, and India all shown here as well. Next. So as far as capacity to act, Boulder has ranked 4th out of almost 400 cities for economic performance as measured for job growth, average annual earning, and gross domestic product gains, as well as total jobs at new businesses. The capacity to act is greater here than in many other places, which further supports the direction we're proposing. Next slide. Given Boulder's responsibility and capacity to act, we're proposing to get to net zero emissions by 2035, which aligns with that likely 66% chance that I spoke of limiting warming under 1.5 degrees. These are the new proposed targets that we are presenting tonight are shown on the right. Previous targets under our 2016 climate commitment show emissions reductions targets on the left for 2020, 2030, and 2050. The new proposed targets are based on today's science. So net zero emissions is balancing any carbon that we emit into the atmosphere by removing an equivalent amount from the atmosphere. And carbon positive means that an activity goes beyond achieving those net zero carbon emissions to create an environmental benefit by removing additional carbon from the atmosphere. And all of the science-based pathways to stay below 1.5 degrees require some form of carbon dioxide removal despite aggressive emissions reductions. So using carbon sequestration to offset our carbon emissions will be fundamental in reaching net zero emissions by 2035. Next slide. So as our learning has evolved, we have new insights and we're proposing changing how we measure success. One of the key insights that we've come to and we've presented in this memo and tonight is that cities can't do this alone. And the success of a few cities alone isn't enough. So change should really yield the greatest system scale impact rather than the optimal impact within a city boundary. And this is a really big shift in the paradigm. And so perception and tracking of success needs to be more fluid in the future, which would allow for these system scales dynamics to guide further in future opportunities. Another big insight really that we've been having and are forming around tonight is that it's really not just about mitigating our emissions. And we have been talking about this for a number of years, but adaptation is a core pillar integrated with the equity design principles. And these are really the core pillars now of this evolution in climate action work. And lastly, we're proposing addressing gaps in previous carbon accounting by targeting systems behind both production and consumption-based emissions. The city will make more headway towards systemic change that incorporates not just our energy, transportation, and waste systems, but also how the community spends its money and the consumption chains the community can influence. Next slide. So now I will discuss some of the proposed objectives and targets under the focus areas that we've been mainly working on. I will walk through regenerative ecosystems, energy systems, and circular materials economy. And as Brett spoke of, the integration of land use and financial systems into our climate action plan is still in its early stages and under development. So they're not presented here tonight, but you'll definitely be hearing more about these areas as the year progresses, and especially as we move towards our comprehensive plan update. And I also just want to note, there's a lot of detail here, and attachment D on page 50 of your packet has a lot of that detail, or most of that detail, on these focus area objectives, targets, and progress measures. And I'm definitely not going to go through all of them, but I will provide some highlights. So next slide. So based on this new framework, these are the objectives under the ecosystems focus area. They really span from increasing carbon sequestration to carbon enhanced ecosystem services. While some of these objectives are integrated into our work, this new framework moves the resilience and equity design aspects of the ecosystem work to a much greater focus. For example, designing actions to maximize equitable ecosystem benefits as a core objective. So next slide. To put this into context and with a more concrete example, the objective of maximizing equitable ecosystem benefits has these targets that you see here associated with it, relating to increasing the tree canopy and reducing urban heat islands. Urban forests can both capture significant amounts of carbon, and creating shade is a crucial strategy for addressing the growing urban heat challenges we will be facing. By way of example related to these targets, Boulder had approximately 16% canopy when we measured it last in 2013. We know we've lost a substantial amount of that because of emerald ash borer and many of the extreme weather events like early and late snowstorms that we have. We're now probably around 12 or 13%. So starting next year, we'll be launching a major community climate campaign around regrowing our urban canopy, with the initial goal being 20% and hopefully going beyond that. Through these actions, particularly focusing on planting in high risk and vulnerable populations, we hope to reduce both average temperatures, but particularly reduce summer extremes by 3 to 5 degrees. And in this and all the focus areas, it's actually, I just wanted to really note the intersectionality of these objectives. So for example, tree planting programs not only reduce energy needs for cooling, but also have proven to improve mental health and community trust. Next slide. So onto energy systems. The objectives really, they've remained consistent in many ways in our many years of working in this area. For example, moving towards 100% renewable electricity is an existing target and will remain to be one. And that's reflected in establishing a safe, healthy, and resilient fossil-free energy system. Other objectives related to our building stock and construction are evolving to reflect the changing approach to our built environment through high performance buildings and our building codes. What's reflected here has a much more central focus on integrating equity to make sure energy is affordable and provides solutions that meet the community's needs. And all these objectives will be implemented and designed through this equity lens. In fact, our affordable housing providers are already leading the way on providing all electric and low carbon solutions. Next slide. So bringing the energy system objective to an example here of ensuring equitable and affordable access to energy. And you see here the targets that are associated with it. And they reflect the needs of accessing basic heating and cooling, clean mobility, and fossil-free electricity. So today, more than 10% of Colorado residents spend 10% of their income on energy bills. And our aim is that by 2035, that number is 4% or less. Some of the work we're doing today around providing free or lower cost solar garden subscriptions to residents with low incomes are moving towards achieving this target. Additionally, equity in the energy space is one of the goals of the Excel partnership that you heard about tonight. So we will see more action in this area as that work unfolds. Next slide. And the circular materials economy. This objective, the objectives in this area really reflect an evolution from our traditional zero waste goals to a framework for circular materials economy, as we've gained a deeper understanding of the impacts of consumption and material manufacturing and disposal. So while the first steps for establishing a zero waste community focuses on what we do with material after it has been consumed and waste has been created, a true zero waste economy must transition from what it is today, which is linear, to circular, where waste and pollution are designed out. Communities keep products and materials in use as long as possible and extract the maximum value from them, and natural systems are regenerated. The objectives here reflect this new paradigm by focusing on circular economy in buildings and repair and reuse of goods, on top of our existing waste diversion efforts. There's also a wonderful opening here for entrepreneurship and innovation. And so next slide. Bringing this one into an example, one of these new objectives is supporting a circular materials economy is making repair, reuse, and remanufacturing easier and more accessible. So this will be tracked through community and these entrepreneurial partnerships, sharing platforms such as what exists today at the Resource Tool Library, and supporting efforts to ensure that materials and products are designed to last with the ability to recycle, reuse, repair, or remanufacture at the end of product life. A lot of R's there. Next slide. So bringing it into the milestones that we're proposing in our packet and here tonight, we are proposing to return to you later this summer with a resolution that will adopt these new climate goals. In the fall, we'll be sharing progress of our work over the past few years, as well as looking forward at the evolution of these strategies. And in December, we would return to Council to review the funding strategies that would be needed to support this work. And onto communications and engagement, the Boulder community is an essential partner in achieving the city's climate goals. And the city anticipates offering several engagement and communication opportunities to make sure that the community's voice is reflected in these efforts, and there's a shared understanding of this new approach to climate action. Communications and engagement events will track these milestones, but it will be ongoing and flexible, really reflecting the need for continuous refinement of the city's climate action priorities and strategies. Some engagement will be more targeted, and there will be a variety of tactics to ensure the engagement is inclusive and accessible. And my next slide is about our environmental advisory board. So we had a chance to have to present this information and have a great discussion with our environmental advisory board last week, and it was past the deadline for this packet. So we wanted to share it with you here tonight. On this slide are the themes we heard and discussed with the board, and I won't go through reading all of them, but I do want to highlight a few. One in particular, the systems focused versus individual action. Making sure that we're not just focusing on systems and disempowering the importance of individual action. And we've really tried to highlight that balance here tonight. It's not an either and or conversation. It's really a need for both. Another one to highlight is the alignment of local policy with the focus on systems change and how we prepare for climate change. And we brought this up with, that the land use piece and how we're making and aligning major decisions around things that are happening across the city and our community and how we're preparing for climate change based on this new framework. And then another key theme is which is a big focus of this meeting, is the importance of carbon drawdown and ways in which the city can expand these efforts. And there was some exciting conversation around partnerships with the university and federal labs to stimulate innovation around carbon capture and utilization. And this is another area that's really growing in our work. And we're very excited to continue this conversation over the year with our board as these strategies evolve. Next slide. And that wraps up the end of our presentation. We do have some questions for you that were in the packet. So at this point, I believe I'll hand it back over to Councilmember Wallach to walk through the questions for council.
All right. First, does anybody have any specific questions based on the presentation this evening? Aaron and Junie and Sam and Mirabai. Okay.
So, well, let me start by saying thank you for an extraordinary presentation and analysis of the problems that confront us. I think, what you've all put together, the way you've been thinking about it is truly impressive. I haven't seen anything quite like this as I've read other things around the internet and the world. So, really am impressed, and thank you so much for what you're bringing here to the city. So, Gail, is it possible to go back to the presentation, a handful of slides back on the circular economy, please? There we go. The next one, please. So the last bullet point here is about materials and products are designed to last with the ability to recycle, reuse, repair, or remanufacture at the end of product life by 2030. And it's a little unclear to me to the extent to which we have control over that, right? Like I get about the use of sharing platforms and entrepreneurial partnerships to promote repair and reuse, but to what extent do we have as a city have control over how materials and products are produced in the next 9 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can start to answer it, and if any of my colleagues want to chime in, to me, I guess what I would say in relation to that is, you're right. As a city ourselves, we don't have a whole lot of control, but I would say in our regional collaborations and some of the work that we do through our partnerships and things at the state level, that there might be some other levers that we can pull. And it might be through policy and through incentives and through regulation that we could collaborate across the region with. But when you start to look globally, it feels a bit overwhelming on how we would actually impact things that are coming from China or India or other parts of the world where a lot of our goods are manufactured. So I don't think it's an easy one to tackle. I think it's one that we see as necessary to change the systems here. I don't know if we have a lot of clear pathways in our mind, but I know Jamie Harkins is on the line. If she has anything to add, or any of my other colleagues, I will pass it along.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'll just weigh in really quickly. I think Yael did a really good job at answering that question. This will be something we'll be exploring in the years to come. I will say, of those levers that Brett outlined, the policy here, I think, will be the one that we'll target first, at least for our city lever to pull. And we work closely with state partners like Recycle Colorado and just right here in town, EcoCycle, to try and influence some state bills that are being developed for future legislative sessions around the right to repair and end market development. So we're really, I think for this one in the near term, it will be on that policy front as we explore more ways to do this in the future. So that's what I would add. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Jamie. Always nice to see you.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. That was my only question. That I'll have some comments later. Thanks.
Okay. Junie, I think you're next.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you for a great presentation. And I really enjoy Brett's section very much. And my question is actually in relations to that. I wanted to know, based on your comment about heat pump technology, you mentioned it, and it's slightly, I don't know if you responded to that earlier, but I didn't capture it. You mentioned subsidies. Is there a requirement as of right now that new constructions are required to use heat pump technology, or is something that we're considering? I just wanted to know a little bit more about that.
I'd like to defer to my colleague, Carolyn Elam, who's our energy manager and who's been working very much on this. Carolyn?
Great, thank you, Junie. And it's a great question. I think we've been very cautious in our code development to not dictate the technology solution, but rather to set performance-based standards and leave it to our very insightful and thoughtful architectural and design community to really design those solutions. Heat pumps tend to be the technology of choice for our residential homes in meeting our code, but they are not mandated through our code.
Thank you. Actually, that's the only question that I had.
Thank you, Junie. Sam?
Great. Thank you, Mark. And I want to say thanks very much to Jonathan, Brett, Yael, and Carolyn. I mean, this is a really comprehensive framing of a very complicated, far-reaching problem. So it was a great setup for us to talk about. There are too many elements to address tonight, but it's a great way for us to think about it. I want to come down to an accounting question first. I believe most of our work has been done relative to a 2005 baseline. So when we've looked at emissions, it's been percentage below 2005. I see in here that the baseline will be shifted to 2018. I was curious about what the thinking was about the 2018 shift. And then after we're done with that, I'm going to come back to embedded carbon. But what about the baseline year?
And Yael, I believe Sam is referring to the carbon, embodied carbon reduction goals relative to the baseline.
I'll just start with the baseline year. So for instance, on page 7 of the packet, we've got reduced emissions 70% by 2030 against a 2018 baseline. And so the first question is, are we going to shift our baseline from 2005 emissions to 2018 emissions?
Great. I'm going to hand it over to Lauren Tremblay, who's on the call, and she's our colleague who's the architect behind a lot of this work.
Hi all. Yeah, so my name is Lauren Tremblay. I'm a sustainability analyst at the Climate Initiatives Department. And the reason for the shift to the 2018 baseline was we were working under ICLEI guidance. So really the recommendation is that cities shift away from a 2005 baseline to align closer to a 2018 baseline. They were really asking for really between a 2016 and 2019 ideally baseline, with 2018 being the ideal. And that was really just because a lot of cities are starting to get into this work now, where they're starting to analyze their annual inventory and emissions. So it was an opportunity for those cities to be able to kind of look at their current conditions and start from there. And the recommendation was also just due to the fact that the IPCC report came out in 2018, and a lot of the forward looking that the report was doing was really looking at, like, based on the current status now in 2018, where will a carbon budget be into the future? So it was really trying to reset the baseline to align with that 2018 timeline. So that's really where the Race to Zero campaign is pushing cities to reset their baseline to. So we're doing that to really align with what the global community is moving towards under that guidance.
Got it. And my only concern really about that is not shifting the baseline per se, but how does our community adapt to, we've been telling them we've done 21%, carbon reduction, and now we'll be at, a few percent at best when we do 2018. So it might be something to think about, how we're going to bring the community along with that change, because we might get it, but others might not. The second thing I wanted to ask about is, Carolyn, what you were starting to talk about, which is embedded emissions. So what does it take to get our iPhones and our cell phones? What's the emissions associated with transporting them? What's the emissions associated with concrete and basement foundations and so on? So it's a really important question. But one of the things that the memo said was doing that is going to make it look like, and truly is, doubling the emissions that are coming from Boulder. And so if we're making both of these shifts at once, how are we going to square it with previous progress? How are we going to square it looking ahead? I think, to me, the challenge becomes all of a sudden we reset to zero on 2018, and now we've got double our emissions. It seems like we need to be clear with the community what's going on there. And then, these targets to 70% by 2030 against a baseline which essentially doubles from what we did 2 years ago is extremely daunting. So I guess the question is, how are we going to use these two changes, and how are we going to bring the community along with that?
Yeah, I'm gonna, if you don't mind me chiming in again, that's a really great point, and it's one we're really thinking about as we move into looking at incorporating consumption-based emissions into our inventory into the future. I will also add that we're looking to include sequestration of our urban forests and trees into our inventory process as well. So there's a lot new stuff that's being integrated, and I completely agree with you that it's going to be a lot of learning that goes along with that. But we're going to be working through the actual inventory process to segment out that information so that it's very comparable to prior years. So we'll be doing we'll break out the consumption-based emissions as kind of like apart from our historically how we've done our emissions accounting. And then you can kind of see a comparison kind of trending over the years so you can understand what that trend is being. They can also look at what the consumption-based emissions are now that we're starting to accumulate those and incorporate them into our accounting mechanisms. So it's a really great point, and we'll try to do our best to try and segment the data in a way that's really comparable year over year, just because we have such a wonderful history of doing our inventories that we don't want to lose that value of being able to track that trend over time. So that's certainly a great point.
That's an excellent answer too. Thank you for that. And it also applies, of course, to accounting the transportation emissions from in-commuters, which is something we've heard about for a long time. But having the old style tracking the old numbers, the previous numbers, and then the new numbers broken out, in additional categories, I think will be very helpful on that. So that's great. I have one other question. And Brett, it goes to your example. You talked about divestment and talked about, some of the financial levers that individuals have. I would point out and then ask, we as an institution have those levers as well. And so to what extent does this kind of rethinking and reframing to a systems change, how are we going to incorporate that with our financial processes? So not only where do we keep our money, but kind of advocacy for public banking and other things like that. So writ large, how is the city as an institution going to look at some of those actions that we need to take that aren't just direct about carbon emissions, but are more about the systemic change?
I entirely agree, Sam. And I think it's one of the reasons I wanted to also in this regard, speak to Junie's question. We have power through procurement. And I was just on a call today with some folks who are talking about carbon transactions. If munis start to step into the game around making carbon transactions, it could be a game changer on a lot of levels. So I think that there's a lot of power in terms of both where we invest, who we do financial business with, and what we buy. And that's one of the reasons why we launched the forum on economy, climate, and community, because we need to normalize this as being a legitimate part of our strategies. And I think that a lot of places might not have seen that as being something that they should or could do. And so I don't think that we're going to leap into this. I know certainly our financial controllers don't want us to leap it there yet, but for good reason. We want to know how this works. And we also want to see that others are coming along with us. So I think we're starting to try to start that conversation, not only here, but also in a lot of other places.
Great. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have next up Mirabai, followed by Rachel, then Mary, and then this evening's Master of Ceremonies. So Mirabai.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, staff. Thanks for a great presentation. I guess my biggest takeaway is how urgent this issue is. Something I personally feel I've been aware of, but I don't know, our whole community is. So appreciate you bringing it up. I guess my question is this. I understand that, what I'm about to talk about is part of our charter, so it's not like you can go do anything about this yourselves, but it's something I think you can help guide from my experience on council. And so my question is that seeing right now as our open space is partially used for, and our precious water rights are used for growing hay for raising cattle, which from my research and understanding is animal husbandry is some of the biggest producers of greenhouse gases. Is there, I guess, desire within staff to help guide council and the community to start using our open space in different ways where we're not killing keystone species, and we could start bringing in animals like the buffalo who work with keystone species, or regarding the carbon sequestration, from, again, information I've had is that it works with keystone species as well as things like hemp farming that take far less water. It really helps with carbon sequestration. So is there a desire for staff to try to kind of adjust the old way of thinking of how we've used our lands to update them, seeing as, again, from the way you put this presentation, things are pretty urgent. So I hope that makes
Thanks,
sense.
Mirabai. It's a great question. And I think it's one of those things, like you said, that we're going to need to be looking at what our charter objectives are with some of our land uses. But we have actually already started down this path following the prairie dog ordinances that were implemented this year. We are supporting a community collaboration that Lindsay Crank and others are a part of to look at how we manage lands in the context of agriculture with prairie dogs and other species to see how we can optimize for that. Now, we've also started a relationship with one of the CU ecosystems labs to start to look at landscape scale management, to look at how we use our water to be able to sustain landscapes that can hold more water, because the capacity of our landscapes to hold and transpire water is going to be critical to cooling us. So I think that we're just starting to move a lot of that work forward. I think a lot more is going to come in the next couple of years.
Great. Thank you, Brett. I appreciate it.
Rachel, you're next.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks for that question, Mirabai. I appreciated it. First, I want to say it is really an honor to live in this city that is working so hard on this issue and to be on this council that's taking part in this important work. So I want to thank staff and community members, and also a shout out to council colleagues. Some of you will be rounding off of council in a few months, and you've been so instrumental in this work. And I just want to say you are all very appreciated. So then I have a couple questions, and they're maybe a little bit in the weeds, so I'm sorry. Hope that's okay. And again, thank you all for bearing with me that my camera is not on. So at the state legislature today, and I think maybe over to the governor's desk, I think that the state lifted preemption on plastics ban. So I just wanted to know what we might be able to do beyond whatever the new state requirements are, and whether we could request an analysis of that and a report back on actions we might want to take on that front before too long.
Yeah, Rachel, let me take a swing at this one, honestly, because it's an extraordinary thing when I can't get a word in edgewise with my colleagues. So I appreciate so much that you're tracking the state legislature. Today was a pretty significant day, not just in terms of the plastics bill, but a number of other bills on the energy side. So just for those of you that are watching that maybe don't track this as closely, House Bill 1162 phases out single-use plastic bags, polystyrene cups and containers, and reverses, as you said, a law that prohibits municipalities from taking action around plastic pollution. And I think it's been regarded as one of the most comprehensive plastic pollution reduction bills passed in the country. And in fact, marks the first time an interior state has taken action to phase out plastics pollution. So I just wanted to reference the significance of that. So just as we think about the analysis, the final version of the bill pushed back the date of that preemption repeal to July 1st of 2024. So we had a little bit of time to think about evaluating the best options for Boulder to further our plastic pollution in our community and the impacts of plastics globally. I wanted to just mention that in flag for our community and council, the really incredible metabolic report that came out just 2 years ago that really starts to look at that circularity of our materials flow. And just to kind of key in on that systems level thinking, rather than just focusing on providing recycling options for single-use plastics, incidentally, generally roughly 10%, I think, or less of plastic waste we generate, I would say societally, not just here, not in Boulder, we're above that, that we generate actually gets recycled properly. So it allows us to think about not just reducing plastic waste pollution, by cleaning up our supply chain, focusing on the role of single-use plastics in product packaging, and ultimately incentivizing innovative packaging solutions. And so I think what we would start to look at is options for a local ordinance to tackle other types of plastics, similar to what other cities have done around styrofoam or utensils and straws, plastic lined coffee cups. So I think we have some really interesting opportunities there, and also look at some extended producer responsibility rules that we might be able to look at, kind of going back to the comment that Aaron made earlier. So how we can influence that kind of systems level approach through this particular bill. That was a long answer and I apologize. I just wanted to let you know that we are absolutely on that, and to recognize that our zero waste approach and reducing and minimizing our waste and thinking about the circular economy is a key component of our climate effort.
Love that answer. Thank you. And it sounds like we can't really do anything until 2024 in terms of preemption lifted. Is that true?
I think that's right. But between now and then, our staff is really going to be identifying and evaluating the best options for Boulder. And I think that's going to be a really critical piece of what we've been looking at for a while. So we can bring back some ideas as we move forward on reporting out on our zero waste work.
Awesome. Thank you. That's exciting. Okay, next question. If I understood the presentation correctly, it sounds like some of our previous efforts were not exactly widely replicated around the nation. And Bob Yates likes to say, we aren't a leader if no one is following. So given the urgency here, I'm assuming that we want to make sure that our decisions are going to be impactful and replicable. So looking first at building codes, I'm worried, are we setting standards that they will be affordable and that we will have builder and owner buy-in? Because I assume we don't want to make requirements so onerous that other cities won't follow, or that we drive middle income households out of the city. So that's my first question on that front.
Carolyn, do you want to take that one?
Sure. It's something, Rachel, we think very carefully about whenever we introduce a new building code. And we do and will, as we look to the next code update, try and do an extensive analysis of the cost implications of any changes. I will say we are very much aligning our building code updates with what's happening nationally and internationally. So we're really seeing a trend kind of centering around these performance-based codes. So they are being replicated. We don't actually, while we had the most aggressive in the country for a long time, I think we're really lining up with many others and trying to build those lessons learned. So we're definitely going to be very cognizant. I do note that when we look to like our affordable housing, our multifamily units, some of our up and coming commercial spaces, they're really largely exceeding the requirements in our code. They're moving towards all electric. Really, the cost of technologies are coming down, and I think that's really telling of where we're going to be heading. And so we will definitely be paying very close attention to that, and we will be talking to you about that as we start to move into our next code update, which is scheduled for 2023.
Okay. And then sort of along the same lines, and following up maybe a bit on Aaron's question about the circular economy. So, and I appreciate that the affordable housing units and the more, did you say industrial or other side, and maybe the $1 million+ homes are exceeding and meeting the requirements. But I am worried about the, sort of everybody in between that. And so if repair costs go up because we require that people buy products that are, built to last and become more expensive, I just want to make sure we're looking at how we expect that sort of average homeowners who maybe are stretched to just make mortgage payments in this expensive town will be able to keep up. So that, I guess that's my second question, is how are we ensuring that, or looking at that?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I would highlight, Rachel, is for a decision we made in our last code cycle was really not to ratchet down the code requirements on repair, renovation, small renovations, to really encourage the retention of existing homes. And so I think we would continue to see some trends where, if we see that having a negative impact on our homeowners as they have to make decisions about their existing homes, I think that's the strategy we would continue to employ. It's something we're trying to be very cognizant of as we really leverage our equity tools to really understand what the impacts of some of the decisions we're making on not just, like you said, on the affordable housing, but on our market rate homes as well.
Awesome, that's helpful, thanks. And then I think my last question, when we look at I think you called it consumption piece, so not the energy system, not the buildings, and I get that historically, we focused sort of on building codes and the builder. It was an obvious place that cities had control, and so we looked at things like electrification of buildings and appliances and things like that. But beyond looking at land use as we consider the climate crisis, and we know that there are so many other factors that are implicated, like food waste and meat and dairy consumption and gas lawnmowers and xeriscaping and water issues and our travel habits and owning second homes and infected trees that are left to spread disease and things like that. So my question is, what sort of policies are we looking at outside of like planning and transportation codes to sort of create some of the broader level, and maybe it's both systems, a system that's creating individual level changes and ideally would be duplicatable. So are we looking at codes that get at some of this stuff that cities don't maybe historically look at?
I'll take a swing at that first, and then that'll buy a little bit of time for some of my colleagues if they want to give a more filled out answer. I think as we start to work our way into thinking about consumption-based inventories and the approach of focusing on impacts that are primarily in production, I think it might point to a need for cleaner production and extending the life of items, in some cases reduction of demand. I don't think that we've really thought far enough along about the policies that would get us there and the role that the city might be thinking about. So we might be looking at targeting carbon intensive consumption categories, targeting life cycle phases around production with highest emissions, supporting shifts in consumption to activities with lower emissions. And the city's role in that could be promoting, it could be funding, could be education and outreach, developing programs and services, and demonstrating, I think, with our own practices. Well, what I will say, Rachel, to that is that this is an emerging body of work that actually is quite exciting. And you heard Lauren Tremblay talk a bit earlier about how this isn't something that Boulder is facing in isolation. We are partnering up with a number of communities through ICLEI, through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and other coalitions to think about how do we actually start to calculate our emissions and be able to report out our emissions in a consumption-based way. What does that really mean? Back to Sam, your question earlier about how we articulate those impacts. And then what really are the roles for the city? What are the potential programs and policies? And so I would say it's yet to be determined on the policy side.
Fair enough. Thanks.
Mary, you have waited patiently. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, staff. This was probably the most riveting memo that I've read, at least in this term. It was absolutely fascinating and exciting to think about at a systems level, how things need to change, and the whole idea of theories of change and how critical that is to be able to solve problems. So I really, really, really appreciated the memo. Thank you very much. I'm not sure that I have tons of comments, and I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to turn those comments into questions. So I think what I'll do is I'll just wait for the comments part rather than try and figure out how to turn my comments into questions. So
Okay.
Are we ready to go there, Mark, or no?
No, I had a couple of quick questions.
Okay, thanks.
One, just as a clarification for me, the new targets that you've been setting are inclusive of emissions from consumption as well?
I think I see Laura unmuting. There she is.
Yeah, so we're aiming to focus our targets on right now our current mechanism for accounting. So they'll be following the historic trends of how we've done our accounting, but we do have separate targets set for our consumption-based emissions that follow, again, the science-based recommendations for how we should be setting targets for consumption-based emissions. So I believe that's a 50% reduction in consumption-based emissions by 2030 and an 80% reduction by 2050, I believe. So we'll still be addressing and tracking those, but just in a little bit of a separate way.
Okay, thank you. I originally had a question on some of the equity considerations in adopting new policies, but I think Rachel got to those. So my last question is, we heard a detailed presentation this evening from Alice Jackson of Excel. In reading your memo, I was struck by first its thoughtfulness, but it was also quite frightening, and it had a very strong sense of urgency to it. Having heard the Excel presentation this evening, do you think that their program for moving forward is equally reflective of that sense of urgency that your memo presented to us?
I'm not seeing anybody jump at that one. Mark, it's a great question, and I don't want to deflect the question, but I think going back to at least what I hear you asking is, does their proposal in their electric resource plan and their clean energy plan sufficiently meet the pace and scale of work that needs to take place? I'm going to answer it this way and say that decarbonizing our energy supply remains a critical factor in our ability to address the climate crisis. That is, I think that's a known quantity, not just here locally, but globally. I mean, that is really something that I think every community is really focusing on. How do we achieve net zero emissions in the timeframe that science tells us that we need to get to? We know that it's a challenge we have to meet, but it's a challenge to which we have answers. And I think we're confident that it can be done in a way that getting to net zero is technologically and economically possible. So the question is, I think goes back to something Sam was saying in his remarks, which is we need to continue to push. We have continued to play that role as a community with our utility provider. And I think it has shown that moving towards things like massive electrification, shutting down fossil-based units, moving away from fossil-based methane gas to other sources of energy, those are critical in our ability to meet the goals that we have not only laid out as a community, but that are required to address the climate science. So I would say that it is absolutely a step in the right direction. We are having a different conversation today with Excel than we were just 2 years ago. And I often think back a decade ago about where we were in terms of renewables, in terms of emissions within the electricity sector, and we've come a long way, but we have to continue to push. There are still questions with respect to where Excel is going, questions around their investment in natural gas, questions around the pace in which they are decommissioning those fossil-based units, the impacts to the communities that they serve. These are all questions that we want to dig into, not just with our community, but how we work with our partners through CC4CA and through our coalitions to continue to apply pressure, not just to Excel, but all of our utility providers. I think it's a critically important piece. And the last thing I'll say on that is that Alice talked, I think, she was responding to Mary's question about how Excel's work is really reflected in the systems-based approach. And what I do appreciate in Alice's remarks is recognition of the comprehensive nature that energy plays. So starting to look at things much more comprehensively in terms of just electricity supply, but how it fits in with decarbonizing our buildings, how it fits in with decarbonizing our mobility systems. So taking that approach, I think, is important. I think it's, again, a really critical step in the right direction. I think we as one community and our partnership communities are going to continue to play a vital role in making sure that we can be as aggressive as we possibly can, because these targets are not just ambitious, they are necessary.
Jonathan, thank you for that answer, and keep pushing. I think we can now turn it over to council for comments, and I think Mary has first dibs on those.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So first, I just wanted to start off by saying that one of the biggest things that struck me about this memo was the focus on social, economic, and environmental. And it struck me that that's how our comprehensive plan used to be based on. And we moved away from that into the sustainability framework. And perhaps in 2025, we may want to consider going back to the three-legged stool. So that's a comment. With respect to looking at, it was page 14, where you illustrate the global emissions per capita and how the poorest communities actually have the lowest emissions rate and the richest communities have the most emissions. So my comment is, in looking at how to develop systems that work, look to the people who have the lowest emissions for solutions. Instead of going out and playing saviors to the poor communities, look at the communities for the assets that they bring to the table, that they have a lot to offer in terms of solutions, because they have already had to do a lot with very little. So, so I think that's an important, perhaps in the category of insights that you presented. Also, to the comment that the Environmental Advisory Board made about not disempowering individual action, made me think about how after the sugary beverage tax, there was an organization that went out and showed all of the different soft drinks, and then right next to them, how much sugar was in them. So it was a visual representation of what the harm that those drinks could do in terms of your health. And so similarly, one of the ways of empowering people to individual action would be to take a similar display and show, say, for example, a compostable cup, plate, and fork. And what is the embedded petroleum in those? So, you know, we consider ourselves being virtuous for using compostable products, but they have embedded petroleum. So, you know, what is the embedded petroleum in those versus carrying around a cup that you refill or a bottle that you refill, something like that. And along with that, to look at what a purchase of a toaster, going and buying it locally versus ordering it from Amazon. You know, what is the petroleum that is attached to something based on how you purchase it. So just thinking about how to raise awareness about the simple things that we do every day have consequences and the impact of those things that we do. In terms of the partnerships and finding out how to change our systems is to look at partnerships in unlikely places. Like instead of just partnering with a whole bunch of environmental organization, partner with organizations like the Poor People's Campaign, Black Lives Matter, to get some insights into what communities want, what communities need, and how much of that is replicable at different scales. One of the things that I thought was very interesting in your memo was the comment about choosing to expend dollars on programs or efforts that yield the greatest system scale mitigation rather than optimal within city boundaries. And that made me think about, well, there might be a whole bunch of policy barriers to doing things like that. So for example, with affordable housing funds, we can only spend those within the city boundary. But what if our affordable housing funds could be spent countywide? We may get more affordable housing countywide, but less within the city boundaries. So what kind of policies present barriers to that kind of, in that specific example, revenue sharing? And then one of the thoughts that came to mind as I was reading the memo is I saw a gap with respect to migration, climate migration, and how, you know, the people will be moving inland from both coasts and northward, well, inland because of sea level rise and northward because of rising temperatures and desertification. So how does that impact all of what we're talking about here? All of these systems changes, and what does that mean in terms of how we move forward? And then just kind of a general comment about how I found, like I said before, I found the whole systems analysis and theory of change just really fascinating, and kind of a broader comment about what other of these seemingly intractable problems can we apply this sort of thinking to. And what comes to mind is homelessness. And how can we apply the systems level collaborative theory of change to homelessness? Because yes, you can, it's important that people have something to eat every day and to bring people that are camping, say, for example, lunch, but that's not going to provide any kind of systems solutions. So to apply it to other problems, and perhaps, and I'm sure that staff is already thinking about what other problems this kind of thinking can be applied to. So that's all the comments I have. And thank you. I really, really, really appreciated this memo and the urgency behind it and all the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Sam, I see your hand raised.
Indeed, thanks. I'm going to just pop down the list of questions real quick as the start. So I think the answer is pretty much yes to all of these. The most important one being the new system-based goals and targets, because I think it is time for a reset. I think we're behind where we need to be thinking about this. The urgency that's in the memo, it captures what we need to be thinking about as far as our goals and targets. And it has seemed to me since the Climate Mobilization Action Plan kickoff that we really needed to address that concern. And so, yes to the system-based approach, yes to bringing it back to us in August to formalize those through a resolution. I think we need to adopt that and, start to bring all of us along as well as our community along with why we're making the change, what the change implies, how consumption is a really important factor in what's going on. So I would say absolutely. I think we need to adopt new goals and targets, progress indicators, and then communicate them and communicate the urgency that's in this memo. I think the way that equity is embedded into the thinking about how to design the programs, we had the conversation with Carolyn about building codes. It extends to everything, and it's not just class, it's race as well. So I think having that at the core, along with resilience and of course emissions, but emissions has been kind of how we've approached this historically, and that's only gotten us so far. So having the equity design principle is critical. If we don't have it, we're only going to make superficial progress, as Brett said. See it in August, absolutely. The framework for clarifying the roles of cities, the only thing I fear about the system level thinking is there's a lot of things in the system that we only have influence over. And so we can't use the fact that we don't control housing policy to ignore our role in homelessness as an example. And in climate, we can't, ignore the fact that we don't control let the fact that we don't control the whole financial system stop us from doing what we can. So I think one thing when we do this system kind of approach and system-based thinking is we need to prioritize first and foremost what we have direct control over. So I think we want to be careful not to fall into a trap of talking about all the external influences like in commuters, saying we can't do anything about that. Well, we can. Plenty of people will work here who don't live here. So I just want to caution that while we take this systems level approach, we don't then shirk some direct actions, which might be hard and might be controversial, that we need to address and take. So that would be the only question about that. And then specific strategies. I think we probably within the climate initiative department have a really good handle on all the detailed strategies on carbon sequestration, energy transition, what buildings need to do to be better. I would say that we need to bring in departments which aren't going to love being brought in, like, of course, the financial group, and they have very good reasons for being conservative, but we need to move that part of the organization forward. Things like utilities, right? Not just obvious things like water conservation, but things like if we're going to build a detention structure on South Boulder Creek to hold floodwaters, how can we do that in a way that uses the best kind of concrete that we can when we're doing that building? Bringing in concepts like that, which may raise the price 3 or 4 or 5%, and everyone's very sensitive about that. But also we want to make sure the embedded energy in that and the embedded emissions in that project are taking into account what you're pointing out for us in the memo. So I think, specific strategies, well, I can't list them all, but how we engage other departments within the city, which are our direct responsibility for the actions they're taking, how we get buy-in from those other departments and how we help them see, like, the fact that procurement is incredibly important is something that everyone in the city will have to be, city organization is going to have to understand in order to be effective on this. So I think you're right on track with everything you're doing. It's going to be super hard, and you're going to be asked, even within the city organization, to work on stuff that you only have influence on and not direct control. And that's where the city leadership, not only council, but the lead department heads and everyone has a responsibility here. So I think this is great. Thank you for bringing it to us. And I think you're on the right track and look forward to hearing about it in August.
Thank you, Sam. Aaron is next, but Jonathan, could I ask you to put up the slide with the 5 questions that you were looking for council direction on, just so we can all see them?
Yeah, although,
sure, give me just
to be
a
frank,
second.
I wasn't going to answer every single one, but
Brett, can you bring that slide up?
Okay, Aaron.
So, yeah, and the reason that I'm not going to address every single one is because I think fundamentally you all are absolutely on the right track. I mean, you're doing amazing work. You're looking at this from I'd say, a visionary perspective about what's required to meet the demands of the climate crisis that we have in front of us. So, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I thought Sam's comments were very good, so I generally agree with those. I think just the one caveat or caution that I want to offer is that there was in the memo, you laid out the sphere of control by the city versus the sphere of influence versus the sphere of interest, right? So there are things that we can do. There are areas where we can do things directly. There are areas where we can influence, like legislative policy, for example. And then there are things that we're interested in, but we have very little that we can directly or indirectly make a difference on. And so when you come back to us with targets, I would also, in addition to the numbers, I'd also like to hear a little bit more about the how, right? Because a target in the abstract without any kind of sense of how we get there, we can say yes to it, but I would feel a little uncomfortable saying yes to. You have a lot of targets, right? Like that you've outlined here, and some of them very aggressive, and we need to be very aggressive. But I would hope that we would have some sense of how we would get there. Obviously, not every detail. It's going to take years of work to figure out how we're going to get there, but some sense of how. And keep in mind that like Sam said, we can't use the fact that we don't have direct control over an area. We can't use that as an excuse to throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do anything. But at the same time, there are areas where we have a lot more control over it. And I think we can be more aggressive in the areas that we do have a lot of control over, and the things where we have more indirect influence, then if we set a really aggressive target, but we only have a 1% influence over whether we get there, I'm not sure how useful that is. So we don't want to end up with a bunch of stuff that we just missed because there's no way that we could make that target. So anyway, just to cross the need for urgent action with how we get there and what we have the ability to implement. So just would love to see a little bit more about that when it comes back in August.
Aaron, thank you for those comments. That's really helpful feedback. And I would just point out, we tried to move in that direction. In the packet, in attachment D, we start laying out a little bit of the focus on the objectives, targets, and progress measures. And I think what we'll use is some of that foundational information that starts, I think, on page 45. I'm looking at the packet right now, to start to flesh that out a little bit more in terms of answering your question. So I really appreciate that feedback.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, and I did look through that. It had a lot of good stuff in it. So maybe a little bit more. Thanks so much.
All right, Rachel.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I will be brief. I agree with Aaron that we are on the right track and don't have a lot of feedback for the specific questions. Wanted to follow up on Brett's wonderful description of land use as contact sport in Boulder. I do agree that land use is a big deal as we move forward with this, and we really shouldn't shy away from looking at land use and its impacts on the climate crisis. And relatedly, I hope this isn't too far afield, but since the memo mentions gearing up for the 2025 comp plan revisions, one thought I have just for staff to take or leave is whether the comp plan is it's properly limited in its scope to land use. So the opening sentence of our comp plan says that the comp plan comp plan guides land use decisions in the Boulder Valley. And, given we already weave in concepts like equity and transportation and climate resiliency, I would challenge us to think about whether our big guiding document with the county should broaden beyond the specified limited focus on land use. That seems sort of like a 20th century approach. And we probably need a 21st into 22nd century lens as we face down what is an existential climate crisis. So while you're looking at that, I just want to flag, I think that the comp plan, if that's going to remain our sole sort of Bible contract with the and vision with the county, that it should be broadened. So that's all my feedback. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. Junie?
Thank you.
Junie, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
That's too bad. Yeah, thank you for this presentation and all the updates. And from what I heard is our next update or code update will be in 2023 or 2025. Is it 2023 or 2025?
So the building code, the energy conservation code will be 2023. So we'll be before council in 2022, late 2021.
Yeah. I thought the presentation was great and all the questions. I think it's hard to answer all of them because the presentation was quite long, but I would say for me, it would be, my only advice would be to definitely keep on leaning into the collaborative efforts between the city and other surrounding cities, because as we know, climate change and climate resiliency and sustainability, it's not something that Boulder itself can solve by itself, right? It's something that will require a lot of us together. And I think having the support of other cities around or neighboring cities actually will make our work a lot more sustainable and a lot more effective. So I think, and that's great. I see that in the memo as well. I think that's very important. And you mentioned, again, I really appreciate the fact that you mentioned, some of the work with the UN. Again, what we see here in Boulder, it's a microcosm of what's going on around the United States when it comes to global emission, and it takes all of us together to really make a dent. So I really appreciate that as part of the presentation. And I think just to reiterate something that I heard earlier from Brett, when it comes to the heat pump technology, and I did get an answer earlier that it's not something that is recommended or that it's not something that is required. It's not required, but maybe I don't know the inner working and the inner processes of how you work with these different organizations when they come and trying to get the process of the building code process. But what I thought to myself, maybe that's something that should be strongly recommended, especially if we're providing subsidies. Again, I think it goes back to something I heard earlier from Aaron. We really want to make a change and make a difference. So we can't just, suggest and also just hope that performance standard, I remember the comment that was made is performance-based standard. It's either you meet it or you don't meet it. But I think having those strong recommendations, from the beginning, might really be helpful in helping us move forward. So I really think this was a great discussion, and thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thank you, Junie. Mirabai, I think you have your hand up.
Thanks. So I'll just make mine very brief. Same thing, it's kind of hard to answer everything. It's a big encompassing, but yes, completely support the work that you're doing, and would love to see this continue to move forward with as much effort and support that the city can provide. I guess the same thing that I'll kind of jump on is collaboration and buy-in. So buy-in, I think, is going to be the biggest thing that we can try to do. And, it's probably done through education, but just kind of thinking of examples, basically going back to World War II and victory gardens and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and they would collect tin, and it was like the whole U.S. bought into World War II to help support the soldiers and the war efforts. And it's like, if we could do that, but for the climate instead, and trying to maybe, I don't know if there's any way to use tactics from programs like that used to work. But just that education and really trying to get a lot of people on board, because I think that's the only way it's really going to make any difference. And again, then my only, framework is I really hope that instead of killing animals, we can start adjusting how we do things. Because if things are really this dire, killing animals for growing grass to me just seems ludicrous. So really support the work you're doing, and really excited to see this as it progresses. So thank you.
Right. In the absence of other hands, I'll make a couple of comments. I think first I want to thank staff for an absolutely eye-opening presentation. It's a new way of looking at this issue, and I think it should be much more widely adopted. I would focus, as Aaron indicated, on things that are specifically achievable. I would radiate out. What can we do in the city that we can control? What can we do with our sister cities? What can we do in the county? Then what can we do in the state? I think that's where we will leverage our efforts to the greatest extent possible and have the greatest impact. And I would urge you to focus it that way. But other than that, I think you are on the right track, and this is going to be hopefully a seminal moment in our city's approach to dealing with climate change and establishing good climate action programs. So I thank you again. Are there any other comments? All right, if that is the case, then I believe we are concluded for this evening, and I am declaring this meeting adjourned. Not as expeditious as Adam does it, but we do our best. So thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Job regardless, Mark. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.